morning we will have council staff. So the order we will go is we'll have planner Adam Vincent, we'll have landscape architect Ben Espy and ecological expert Andrew Wells. We have some speaking notes that Mr. Vincent has sent us, and we'll just follow along with you with that, Mr. Vincent. We also have some questions for you, probably arising out of that, I imagine, and then perhaps we'll go back to your 42A report with further questions, if that's okay. And then in terms of the other two experts, assume they're here or coming?
They're both on.
Oh, they're both online. Okay. Have we got, can I just double check Ben and Mr. Espy and Mr. Wells, are you? Yeah, I have them both online. You're there, you can hear us all right?
Yes, all good.
Yes, yep, no problem.
What we'll do is I'll get you to just address us with some high notes from your assessments and anything you'd like to address us on in relation to what you've heard through the hearing. And then we'll have some questions for you. After that, we'll probably take an adjournment. Depending how long that takes, we might take a break in the middle, but certainly after that, we'll take a short adjournment. We'll regroup just to decide what we want to do for the rest of the finish up this part of the hearing. We've got a minute started with a list of things we'd like you to cover in your reply. So what I thought I'd do is at the end, I'll verbally go through that with you, add anything else that you might have that we might have forgotten, and agree on a bit of a process in terms of timeframes. Also likely to ask the two planners to do some conferencing discussion around conditions, and we can work out whether it's best for you to do that separately to the reply or whether you just put it all in the reply and so on.
And on that, I think there's been some discussions already between the two planners about planning for that.
Okay, great, very pleased to hear that. Excellent, thank you. Okay, great. In your hands, thanks, Mr. Vincent.
So I'm going to break by maybe speaking to the first thing is going to very briefly summarise my wrote my 42. Respond to points raised in evidence and in hearing, and then finally, whether that's straight after this or after addressing Mr. Wells, go through the draft conditions.
Okay.
I'll get up to you when you want that.
It actually makes sense, maybe we do it after the other two. Yes.
So, to summarise my detailed report, I broadly recognised and accepted that the proposal will have a range of adverse effects, specifically looking at effects on ecological, landscape and rural community values. I also recognise that the proposal will have substantial positive effects in terms of potential for renewable electricity generation. I concluded that the adverse effects of the proposal would be more than minor, at least in the short term, but that these could be adequately managed through conditions of consent. Having regard to the EPS for renewable energy generation requirement for the positive effects of renewable energy generation and practical constraints associated with the development, I concluded the proposal would be consistent with the objectives and policies in section 13 of the district plan and in the regional policy statement. I consider that proposal was not an appropriate use under the National Policy Statement for Hydrographic Land, specifically 59. But with having regard to the overall objective of that policy statement, I concluded that it wasn't contrary to it. Overall, I recommend the application be approved, subject to exclusions. So to go over what's come up in the hearing, I've got a few initial comments to some of the things that came up. One of Mr. Brady questioned whether the proposal should be a plan change as opposed to a resource consent. In this case, we've got a specific rule in the district plan, rule 13.4, which provides a specific consenting pathway for power generation facilities across the district. The reason given for this rule does make it clear that applications under this rule can have significant effects. Of the opinion that by a plan change, always a valid option to in that park, but in this case, the developer is in the parkway and the applicants would like to use that process. Now I wanted to know, there's a bit of discussion about the Energy Bay solar farm with Benson Road. So just a few quick stats. I know the panel will read the application, will be able to read the application for that. That was spread over an area of about 19.5 hectares, of which panel would cover about 54.5. And it would have a generating capacity of around 44 megawatts AC. So quite a bit smaller than this facility. It was also intended to connect through the substation, but again, there wasn't a lot of detail with the application exactly how it was going to be. That was largely left up to the consent topic and transfer. To answer Mr. Commissioner Bray's question for Mr. Parker's submission about earthworks associated with fill irrigation, Rule 4.7.6J.B of the district plan, which covers earthworks, exempts earthworks associated with farming activities, so in terms of the area one, that sort of thing. That exemption would include irrigation works, so the works described by Mr. Parker would be considered.
I'll just clarify. Just to clarify, the intent of my question was not to question the consenting from Mr. Parker. It was to try and get an envelope around what the district plan allows on this site in relation to earthworks. And are you about to address that, or about whether the earthworks on this site fully comply with the plan?
Given section 36 zone, there isn't a standard.
Right. Okay. Yep. Okay. All right.
But generally speaking, for rural areas, the district plan proceeds with a wide approach.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Section 13, we're looking at a complete code. So under section 104, there's the objectives in section 13 that you're having regard to in the decision-making process. However, the provisions, particularly we're looking at policy 13.7, do talk about managing effects on using values, landscape values, kind of things. Naturally, that begs the question of relevant values are. And in this case, given the areas in the rural resource area, myself and Mr. Mangidi both opted to use those values described in section 4 to guide what values will be application. And that's fine through into the assessment. Talking about the question of bonds. In both my experience and talking to a few of my colleagues with a bit more experience in how CLC manages bonds. Typically, a bond over CLC would be either held as cash, that's by a third party law firm, common trust, or it would be secured through a bank guarantee or similar. So, in this case, I don't think would be all that different to the agreement that the applicants described would be entered into 20 at least in terms of
On that, do you think and you may not have the knowledge to answer this, so that's fine. I think what we heard from Mr. Shipton is that it would effectively mean he is required, or he's also required to set up 2 bonds and therefore would have double the financial, that there would be double financial implications of that. Do you see any way that it could be done such that that wasn't the case? Somehow they were shared or so on, or is that really a question for the applicant?
To be perfectly honest, I think there's been a little bit of misinterpretation of what I was trying to achieve here.
Okay.
The idea I had in mind was that it would be preferable for CADC to be a party to this, essentially the same agreement. It was never my intention to suggest there be a fully separate bond for CADC and for the landowners.
Okay.
And I agree that having 2 bonds would be overkill in this case. colleagues after writing my 42 report, they suggested that having that arrangement would be a little bit tricky to manage. I wasn't quite able to fully work through how that, what the implications of that might be. That might be a question that could be directed at myself, and possibly they may have more experience in how that could work.
It's on our list.
In the council as a regulatory authority has an obligation to the public, ensure the effects of activity will be managed. Just to slip things in, if the descriptions of the guarantee entrance landowner would be, like as I said, effectively what you would expect to see, like how we expect bonds to work. In my opinion, that agreement between the Helios and the landowner may not provide sufficient ability for council to ensure that the cost of restoring the site is borne by the consent holder. I can effect that essentially the site. The concern I have there is, even if the landowner had bond payout to them, if they weren't considered to be the consent holder, council loses its ability to enforce the conditions on them. Then council outfit may be able to give any thoughts on who would be the consent holder in the case of the bonds being paid out to the landowner. Essentially, they become the consent holder. I agree with the position that the risk of full default by both the operator and the landowners is low. And while it's not binding on commissions, I also agree with the panel in Harmony Energy's Martin solar farm flashback application that short of a financial inability to decommission the site or any other extenuating circumstance like that, the enforcement mechanisms in the RMA will generally be adequate. But I do consider that the risk isn't zero, and that may have a significant effect on rural character or environmental quality if the site's left left undecommissioned or it's not decommissioned. So I think if the panel is going to accept financial guarantee in favour of the landowners as inadequate, I think we need to be satisfied that either the landowner becomes a consent holder in that case, or of that risk of having both parties default is sufficient. Particularly given the concerns that have been raised by submitters, I think that a bond in favour of the council, whether that's paid for the same bond used in landowners or not, would be my first preference to manage this risk. But as I said, if there's certainty that the consent holder is going to the consent form to the landowner to comply with, I consider that. But essentially, we'd still be able to perform a regulatory function against the party who has the ability to decommission the site. Of course, you have any questions.
And it's very helpful that covers what I was hoping you would cover.
Okay, so I'll move on to construction effects.
If you just raise your voice a little bit, I think some people over here are struggling to hear you.
Also whether I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So in relation to construction effects, I stand by the conclusions in my 42 report that the proposal will have adverse effects during construction. However, on the whole, I consider that they'll be able to be adequately managed through conditions of consent, particularly in relation to construction traffic noise vibration. In relation to whether construction traffic should use Ramsey-Naseby or Ramsey-Back Road, I'll just draw the panel's attention back to paragraph 99 of my 42 report, where I confirm that it's council's infrastructure manager's preference that any vehicles use the sealed roads where possible and will continue to establish the road anywhere. And that's just at his capacity as the local government authority. In terms of construction lighting, the points raised by Business 3, my proposed condition 33 included requirements that permanent outdoor lighting as part of the operation of the facility should comply with standards similar to Naseby dark sky standards. For example, having light sources shielded from afar, security lighting and a motion sensor, that sort of thing. The operating hours, the construction hours proposed by the applicant don't seem to go too far into dusk, even in the middle of winter. But it's my understanding that lighting would only be required for short durations each day over the winter period. And this will be when the sky is not fully dark, so I'm not sure there'll be a significant effect from construction lighting, at least while construction is happening. But the panel may wish to consider a similar requirement to my proposed condition 33 for construction lighting as well. If they think that would be good.
And is that, have you had a look at Ms. Van Heady recommended conditions?
There. Another one that said largely.
Sure.
So there would be within
The version that we've got, 40.
Oh, 40.
Give us a moment. So my read of that is that it relates to, doesn't specify whether that's construction or operation, or it's just lighting. Yes. And so, we deal with conditions separately, but just flagging that up, because that's that one. Yeah.
Accommodating workers, fully accept the applicant that overall will fluctuate. Still going to be a very significant portion of these rain for these current populations, for example, but I do accept it looks like there's a range of options that could address that point. Spreading demand out into other towns, building temporary accommodation, those sorts of things. Temporary accommodation may be subject to its own consenting requirements. For example, if they're located in a rural area, they would need a consent. But I'm comfortable that the effects of that accommodation could be addressed separately if it's required.
And so on that, do you, something I'm thinking about is how much of that is an issue for us, in the sense that, obviously if it was granted, the consent holder would need to source their construction workers from wherever, and the contractor would be responsible for that and any potential accommodation of those people. Is that, do you think that's an environmental effect of this project that we need to concern ourselves?
I think it will depend on exactly how that accommodation situation works. And I think they're separate enough that they could be considered separately.
Mm. Yeah, I understand your point that if they wanted to, construct an accommodation facility, then that would be considered on, presumably would need local consent. Or the district plan rules would apply at least, and so the effects of that facility itself would be covered separately. Some of the submitters were raising concerns about sort of all of the Airbnbs or other tourist accommodation being sort of gobbled up by the project over that construction period or parts of it. And I'm just wondering whether you think that's an environmental effect that we need to manage or not.
1 second, challenge sheet, something like that.
Sure, thank you.
Short answer is, I think it is an effect that can be considered. And I'd include in that sort of effects on the roading network of how people get to and from the site. but at the same time, I do think those following effects on businesses, in my mind, don't seem like they're being particularly substantial effects. And I think through a construction management plan, I think it depends on how people. Yeah, I think those could be.
Yeah. And presumably these positive and negative effects, if in terms of, that's talked about, workers being in the area, using cafes and other, that sort of
Correct. I think there's both positive
and then I'm just sort of interested in whether, if workers from the project used up all the tourist accommodation, that's an extreme, we don't actually have any evidence to say that's the case, but say that did happen. Is that more of just a demand supply issue, or is it actually an environmental effect of the project?
My first thought is that it would probably be a bit more demand supply.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Can I just see if I can move the mic a little bit closer? People on Teams are having real trouble hearing Adam.
Yes, please do. Yeah. Please try now.
All right, we'll try again now. Let me just sort of start carrying on.
Yeah, why don't you start carrying on and we'll get if people online could just pop in the chat whether this is assisted to hear Mr. Vincent Eater. Okay, so we've finished with accommodation workers, I think, or are you still on that topic? Yes. Okay, noise.
I'll touch briefly on noise and Mr. Robertson's evidence. He's confirmed that noise would remain within relevant noise limits and acceptable levels during both construction and operation in section 11 of his evidence. In particular, I rely on his prediction that daytime operating noise levels will be similar to background noise levels by the time it reaches an observer. On that basis, I'm happy that the noise effects of the proposal and vibration during construction will be able to be adequately managed through conditions of consent. In terms of the applicant's proposal to remove the monitoring condition, I agree with the submitters that a level of construction noise monitoring should be required. I'll go into a bit of detail when discussing draft conditions how that could look.
I have a question for you on that, Mr. Vincent. So we heard from Ms. Boyce yesterday around the concerns about noise and vibration for her animals kept on site. Is that something that you
I haven't discussed it directly with Mr. Robertson.
we can ask him when we talk to him? He's the applicant.
Yeah, he's the applicant.
Of course, yes.
We can ask the applicant to deal with that in their reply if needed.
For the panel's benefit, I'll drop down quickly to page 8 with my notes, because I do give a bit of commentary on that point.
Okay.
I'll go through that now and then we'll jump back up.
Yeah.
So while it's fresh.
Okay, either way. It might be easier for you just to carry on down through your notes.
Yeah.
We can be agile, that's fine.
Okay. In that case, we'll put a pin in it and come back.
Sounds good.
Regarding glare and transport effects, I'm in agreement with Mr. Copeland and Mr. Logan in their evidence that the effects of the proposal on the safe and efficient operation of the roading network can be adequately managed through conditions of consent, including screening, tilting the panels to minimise glare and avoid yellow levels of glare in mornings and evenings, and through construction management plans. To respond to Mr. Swinburne's oral submissions, in paragraph 85 of my 42 report, I did consider strobing glare for road users. I concluded that primarily through the orientation of the panels running roughly parallel to the road would be sufficient enough to reduce strobing to a point where I don't think it would substantially change the safety effects. beyond the evidence of Mr. Logan and Mr. Copeland. In terms of the amenity effects of glare, I think it's fair of the submitters to point out that these effects have had a bit of a light touch in the application and in my 42A report. I do consider that green glare would have an amenity effect before landscaping becomes effective at blocking that glare. If I speak a bit more generally, the rural provisions in the district plan try to encourage development that minimises glare from buildings. It can detract from the open character of rural areas and have an amenity effect for nearby parties. Primarily, this is achieved by using low reflectivity colours and materials. And I guess a general assumption that buildings don't typically take up that much of a rural landscape on the whole. You might have a couple of buildings, but on the context of a rural landscape, they're relatively small and spread out. Just for completeness, I do know that that doesn't control colours and materials of structures that are incidental to agriculture. So structures such as irrigation pivots can still be made of materials like unpainted steel that can create a bit more glare. So the district plan tries to manage it, but it doesn't avoid glare in its entirety. The applicant has proposed to reduce glare through adjusting backtracking angles and landscaping primarily. It's my opinion that my thought that the glare will only be occurring when the sun's already low in the sky and it'll be limited to winter months. And in the medium to long term, it's expected to be blocked by vegetation. Backtracking would help to lower those effects in the meantime. And based on Mr. Logan's modelling, we're looking at durations where glares forecast to be measured in low numbers of minutes per day, as opposed to, let's say, the duration is relatively short. I accept that there are limitations in Mr. Logan's modelling, as he's pointed out, but I consider that having requirements to manage glare through still proposed condition 30 would help to address those uncertainties in his modelling. Essentially, that allows a method to look at what's happening and address it as needed. So on the whole, I agree with the submitters that glare will have an amenity effect, but I consider that that effect will not be substantial and that it's able to be adequately managed. In relation to landscape effects, I stand by the conclusions in my 42A report that the visual and landscape effects of the proposal can be adequately managed through conditions, noting that Ms. McManaway and Mr. Espy are both generally in agreement about the landscape effects of the proposal. In terms of the points raised by, I believe it was Ms. Boyce and Mr. Carr about rural amenity values and effects on nearby outstanding natural landscapes, again, generally speaking, the district plan tries to limit development spreading up into higher elevation areas, but it's generally a bit more accepting of development on lower elevations and valley floors. Views out from outstanding natural landscapes aren't a matter that have typically been given a lot of weight in this planning context in previous decisions made by council. In his peer review, Mr. Espy was accepting of Ms. McManaway's initial landscape assessment conclusions that from elevated viewpoints, a mixture of distance and the presence of other landscape features would mean that, yes, there's still a visual effect, but that the effect would not be significant. I agree with this position. The solar farm will be visible from viewpoints such as the Kakanui Range, the Ida Range. However, when viewed in the context of the wider landscape from this distance, I'm satisfied that won't be a significant effect.
Can I ask a question on that? Has either Ms. McManaway or Mr. Espy specifically assessed viewpoints, both viewpoints in their reports?
Based on McManaway's, I believe no, and I don't believe Mr. Espy has either.
Okay, so
what gives you confidence to come to that view then?
That's come from largely my own experience of being up in the mountains and looking out over onto those landscapes. Not specifically in relation to this application, that's a general observation.
Okay. Oh, well, I'll ask Mr. Espy about that as well. Thank you.
As a couple of the submitters pointed out yesterday, the applicant's not indicated where they intend to source irrigation water from for their proposed landscaping. And regardless of the source, the submitters all do note the slow growth rates of plants in Manitoto, particularly where there's water not available. I believe Dr. Wells agrees with that point, and you can question him more about this, but my understanding is he considers that growth rates are likely to be more of a potential limiting factor than mortality rates in this case. I agree with him that irrigation water should be provided, and for the longer time that it's available, the better, in order to maximise growth rates. Particularly given, as someone has pointed out, the application does rely quite heavily on that land factor. Moving on to sort of ecological avifauna effects. In terms of Ms. Mahedi's evidence regarding appropriate wetland setbacks, my recommended condition requiring a 10-metre setback, unless otherwise approved by the RC under the National Environmental Standards for fresh water, was, in my mind, a pragmatic response to the fact that building the facility with a 5-metre setback off the smaller wetlands will require further discretionary consents from the Otago Regional Council. And that was, yeah, as I mentioned in my report, that was largely desired to avoid CODC or the panel issuing a decision that could in any way preempt or influence that decision that ORC would have. One observation I did have was that, so it was paragraph 5.22 of his written submissions. Mr. Mahanic submits that it is not appropriate to assess a setback distance from wetlands based on the NES for freshwater. My question in response to that is, if the correct method for determining an appropriate setback from wetlands is not the National Environmental Standard that sets setbacks from wetlands, then frankly, what is?
The question for you there. So, Dr. Morris pointed out an excerpt from Mr. Wells' assessment where Mr. Wells himself says that while his assessment recommends a 10-metre setback for all wetlands is recommended, but that it's not a statutory requirement from his perspective. How would you respond to that? How have you taken into account Mr. Wells' technical input in terms of what you're saying here?
The condition I drafted was largely in response to Mr. Dr. Wells' evidence as peer review, where he flagged that particular standard. And I believe he was the one that suggested there could be concerns there off the top of my head. In terms of the matters within CODC's jurisdiction, we feel I am comfortable that a 5-metre setback wouldn't be automatically inappropriate, having regard to all the evidence that's been presented. But I do still stand by my decision that I don't think it would be particularly appropriate for the panel with CODC's, with the District Council's jurisdiction, to issue a resource consent subject to a condition that allows an activity that goes beyond permitted activity standards under a different jurisdiction.
Thank you.
And just note that the proposed wording allows flexibility for Helios to build closer to the wetlands if approved by ORC, so it wouldn't create any additional tension there in my mind. We're where Helios may be forced to come back to CODC for variations, for example.
I just want to test that. So you've said it would be inappropriate for CODC to issue a resource consent subject to a condition that allows an activity to go beyond a permitted activity standard under the regional council's jurisdiction. Is it, and when you say inappropriate, do you mean unlawful? I mean, you've said inappropriate, you obviously haven't said unlawful, because it's two different jurisdictions, different effects that are being managed. The applicants acknowledge that they would need to get a separate consent. So that those effects would be considered by the region. Why would it be inappropriate? What's your concern there? Just that it's administratively a bit clumsy, or
I don't think it would be
a significant issue with that.
I don't think it would be unlawful. I'm just essentially trying to avoid, to put it bluntly, trying to avoid this consent being able to be used sort of as essentially as leverage or as anything that could influence ORC's decision making. Where if hypothetically you can make an argument that it's already been approved here by this council, why you, like, for argument's sake, why are you pushing back on it now? That's more or less the situation.
And just to be clear, just in your, and I appreciate these in speaking notes, but you've written appropriate in your notes, but you meant inappropriate, don't you?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's sort of a, but the region would have its own matters that it needed to consider with its own decision. So
Correct. Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, which is why I've said sort of in terms of the matters within council's jurisdiction.
Yes.
I don't think that it's essentially, it's not something that it's not a situation where I think a 10-metre setback is absolutely required. That makes sense.
Yeah, okay. So, I see. So you've got the condition such that if there was a consent, it would allow it. So it wouldn't mean that the applicant would have to come back to get a variation.
Yeah, the wording would say 10 metres unless otherwise approved by the target region.
Right. Okay.
Well, provided that it could be closer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was trying to limit that friction as much as I could.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
In terms of my reference in my 42A report to offsetting of ecological values, so that was brought up on Tuesday. My understanding of remediation is essentially fixing up the effects of an activity after the fact so that effect no longer occurs. For example, in this case, my mind is that the removal of the panels at the end of the duration of the consent would remediate the landscape effects of those panels. Or another example, the effects of a mine pit might be remediated through progressive backfilling. Offsetting is undertaking activities that provide a benefit where there is an outstanding continuing adverse effect with the intention of creating broadly no net loss in values. In this case, I think there would be an outstanding adverse effect caused by the loss of extant Indigenous vegetation. So I think the proposed planting better falls within the realm of being an offset. I personally also consider that offsetting can occur within a different location on the same site to address one of the questions that was raised on Tuesday. However, I do think this is largely an academic point, given in this case we're not subject to the more rigid effects management framework that's in the National Policy Statement for Indigenous biodiversity, where those sorts of distinctions can have a lot more importance. However, given this, I do stand by my use of the word offset in paragraph 52 of my 42, but I do still want to impress on the panel that no matter how it's described, I do still consider that the ecological effects of the proposal, including the loss of vegetation that's currently on the site, will be able to be adequately managed through the native plantings proposed by the applicant.
Thank you. So, are you also relying on Dr. Wells' views there in terms of arriving at your opinion about offsetting?
Yes, that was something we discussed, and he was of the same.
Thank you.
Briefly touching on my initial proposal for an additional survey for spring annuals. I've talked that over with Dr. Wells, and we're both comfortable with the evidence of Morris that an additional site survey wouldn't be required, given there doesn't seem to be suitable habitat across most of the site. I'm also happy with the conditions proposed in relation to avifauna management that have been agreed between the applicant and the Department of Conservation. I do agree it's quite a conservative approach, but given the uncertainty about bird striking effects on avifauna in New Zealand, I agree that those conditions are reasonable, and they also give an opportunity for some New Zealand-based research that could be of benefit to future projects. Overall, I'm satisfied that the ecological effects of the proposal, both in terms of terrestrial ecological values and avifauna, can be adequately managed through conditions if consent is granted.
Yeah.
Touching on fire risk, I do accept Mr. Nini's comments in paragraph number 6.3 of this evidence that there's Australasian guidelines that do consider use of water on a photovoltaic fire safe under specific procedures. It's, to be perfectly honest, it's not something that makes logical sense to me, but I'm happy to defer to those standards that exist. Having on-site storage would give firefighters an initial supply of water to use. That can be a static supply, so it doesn't have to be an ongoing source of water. Based on Fire and Emergency New Zealand's Firefighting Water Supplies Code of Practice, 12 tanks would be unlikely to provide full coverage of the site. Just for context, that standard requires a water supply point be within 90 metres of the structure or the item that it's intended to cover, provide coverage for. 12 tanks with a 90-metre circle covers about a quarter of the site. I also agree with the submitters that it doesn't seem like a 4-metre access strip will form a particularly effective fire break. In my experience, they tend to be quite a bit larger. But my understanding is that it's primarily intended to be an access path to allow FEN's broader access across the site, which that track would achieve that. Overall, I think I do have a couple of concerns with management of fire, but given the correspondence with FENS and that they're happy with on-site storage as they're proposed, and they're happy with deferring detailed consideration of fire management to management plans as conditions of consent, I'm happy with that approach and consider that the increased risks of fire would be able to be adequately managed in principle. The panel, in that case, the panel just needs to be satisfied that that detailed consideration can be deferred to management plans after the fact, after this consent.
Okay.
Is that working better for the submissions being up here, or is it still too quiet?
And if we get any complaints online?
So some said it was better and then somebody else said it was worse. I was kind of 50-50 on that.
I think we're doing our best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
moving on to land productivity. In his submissions, Mr. Minnick notes that the MPS HPL requires specified infrastructure have a functional or operational need to locate in an area of highly productive land. I agree that this allows two tests, either showing a functional need or an operational need, and that only one of those tests needs to be passed. He implies that my assessment only considers the functional needs, not the operational needs of the facility. Just to clarify, in my assessment, I considered both. So I considered both at the same time, but except that the wording I used wasn't particularly explicit there. To quickly summarize, so to go over those two, in the definitions of the National Planning Standards, a functional need would relate to the need to locate an activity in an environment with particular characteristics. Operational needs relate to the technical or logistical reasons a facility might need to be in a particular location. For example, a functional need might include access to solar radiation or the presence of a specific resource, for argument's sake, coal. And an operational need might include proximity to the national grid, transmission networks, transportation networks, population centres, and those sorts of things. So that's the paragraphs 173, 174 of my 40 report. That's where I've discussed both of those in detail. I've had the opportunity to review both the Meridian and CJ Industries decisions from the Environment Court, albeit my first time reading both these cases was Tuesday evening because they weren't referenced in Council's written submissions. They came up organically at the hearing. In Meridian, specifically paragraphs 340 to 344 of the court's decision, the court concluded that there was a functional and operational need for the wind farm proposed in that case to be established in the proposed location. With respect to counsel for the applicant, I'm not quite sure where he drew his conclusion that the case is precedent for functional and operational needs being able to be applied to a broader area instead of being unique to a site. In Meridian, reference is made to a need to be in that location or located as proposed when discussing functional and operational needs. To me, that reads like the court was focused on the specific site subject to that application. The only real line I can draw through the submissions is that the court didn't consider it necessary to consider alternate sites in the same area that didn't contain highly productive land. That said, I do recognise it's based off essentially my first reading of the case. So counsel for the applicant are more than welcome to rebut this in the applicant's reply, in case I've missed anything. But for the time being today, I've made the decision not to apply that case in the way submitted. Given this, and considering both the functional and operational needs outlined in the application and in my 42A report, I still do consider the proposal to be contrary to clause 3.9 of the MPS HPL for the reasons given in paragraphs 175 and 176 of my 42A report. Given the close proximity of another similar site that doesn't include any land subject to the MPS, I don't consider there to be a functional or operational need to locate on that specific site. However, if the panel accepts the submissions of Mr. Minnick in relation to Meridian, I think that the application's conclusion that there is both a functional and operational need to locate in this general area is a reasonable conclusion in terms of clause 3.92J of the MPS. I agree that in CJ Industries, the court concluded that clause 3.9 (3) does not require nil or no loss of highly productive land. That case was related to a quarry, but I don't see why the reasoning on that point couldn't be applied here. It seems to relate pretty clearly to the application of the MPS HPL outside the strict facts of that case. And if I were to apply that logic to clause 3.93 in this application, I'm satisfied that the proposal minimises any cumulative loss of highly productive land. And that's for the reasons set out in paragraph 177 of my 42 report. So I think that adequately addresses that clause.
Is it a matter you can consider in that way, or is the functional operational requirement something that has to be adhered to, and there's then no pathway, or are you still able to consider the overall objectives of the MPS in coming to a decision?
I think let me pull up the RMA quickly. Just having a quick look at section 104. So when considering an application, the consent authority must have regard to the relevant provisions of national policy statement. I agree that includes all of it.
Yep.
So that includes the entirety of that policy statement, not just the objectives and policies. So I think a very strict reading using that logic would say if it's an inappropriate use under 3.9, it should fail that test. It should fail to be consistent with the policy statement. Yes, I think when I'm considering that policy statement in the context of the wider application and having regard to it, even if I were to consider the proposal to be inconsistent with the policy statement, I don't think that would be fatal to the application because of how it essentially because of how it minimises those effects on productive land.
Thank you.
Speaking in terms of productive capacity a bit more generally.
So just hold on that.
Sure.
Would you just have you got the MPS HPL?
Yes.
I wonder if you could just take me through that. So clause 3.9, protecting highly productive land from inappropriate use and development. Must avoid inappropriate use, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got 3. Can you just take me through clause 3, A and B? Is it the... Can you just take me through 3.9, how you've applied that?
Sure. So as mentioned, under 3.9, territorial authorities are directed to avoid inappropriate use or development of highly productive land that is not land-based primary production.
Yes.
There's a series of the list of activities that aren't inappropriate uses, with the assumption being that anything that's not listed is inappropriate.
Yeah. Okay.
In this case, we're looking at clause 2JI, which is so
yes,
an activity that's associated with the development, operation, decommissioning of specified infrastructure.
Yeah.
Which this facility would be specified infrastructure.
So that's the exemption pathway. Yeah.
Provided there's a functional or operational need for the use or development to be on highly productive land.
Yeah.
So if there's not a functional or operational need, then it doesn't meet that exemption.
To be on the highly productive land. And is it your view, based on your current understanding of the Meridian case, that it doesn't have a functional or operational need to be on the land?
Correct. On the basis
on the highly
there's-
productive land.
Yeah, correct. On the area of highly productive land, on the basis that there appear to be other similar sites in the vicinity that don't have any identified highly productive land on them.
Right, and so that's why it's the issue around whether it's this specific site versus the general locality is important.
Correct.
Yes, okay. Hmm, okay, yep, thank you. That's helpful.
In terms of productive capacity more generally and sort of the ongoing ability to use the site productively, I do recognise the farming experience of Ms. Crossan and accept that there will be practical limitations on farming the site. I think that's just going to be part of the inherent nature of having panels on the site. Things such as fertiliser application, resowing, pasture management could be more complicated, and I do agree that we don't have a great idea from the applicant over exactly how this would look over the life of the facility. I don't think that's fatal to my conclusions about the productive capacity of the site, because in principle, I can't see why there won't be ways that those limitations can't be worked around. And a lot of that's just going to be an operational matter for the landowner, how they continue to manage the property. But the applicant may wish to talk to that in their reply, as they see fit. One of the other questions that came up on Tuesday was in relation to the evidence that was relied on to determine the productive capacity of the site. Primarily, for my part, I relied on a technical paper prepared for the Ministry of Primary Industries, which is referenced in paragraph 79, footnote 19 of my 42A report. That paper specifically looked at grass growth around solar panels, and it did include a case study in the Naseby area, just obviously not exact scale, exact arrangements of panels that are proposed by Helios, and did predict a small, I think around 3% reduction in overall grass yield, but the study didn't find very strong statistical significance between the presence of solar panels and grass growth. I took that 3%, roughly 3% reduction to be a fair indication that grass growth and other factors such as stocking capacity wouldn't be significantly impacted by the solar farm, so there wouldn't be a significant reduction in the ability to graze sheep. One of the things I did realise is I didn't actually provide a link to that document, so I'm happy to provide that to Ms. Lyons to see that around.
Great, thank you. Do you know, in terms of that report, we can obviously read it, but some of the concerns raised by Ms. Crossan yesterday were that things like how would you, apply fertiliser, how would you re-sow grass, those sort of things. Did it? How long was the study for? Did it deal with those sorts of things?
It didn't deal with it. Looked at
the actual just
how it affected growth rates in pasture.
Okay.
A few other things left to touch on. The first one there is in relation to the effects on Real Dog Company, the Voices business during construction. I do understand Ms. Voice's concerns about how the proposal, particularly construction noise from pile driving, might impact on the core of their business. Unfortunately, the construction standards in the district plan, the district plan uses weight measurements of sound based on the sensitivity of human hearing. So it means there's limited ability to consider how those effects, how that noise affects other animals such as dogs. That said, I do recognise those concerns about impacts on her business. I think there are a couple of different ways that it could be managed. Given, particularly for piling, we're looking at a construction rig that's moving around the site. For example, there may be opportunities for those works to be timed, to line up with quieter periods where they're closest to the Voices property. So as a way to try and minimise loss of business any loss of business that does happen. And the panel could also consider essentially tightening down the pile driving methodology in conditions of consent, for example, requiring use of noise dampening slugs and that sort of thing during construction.
On that though, we have evidence from one noise expert in this case.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
unless that was offered by the applicant, I'm not sure whether we would have any ability to impose tighter controls on noise. What do you think?
I guess not necessarily tighter than what Mr. Robertson says, but as I think it was Mr. Healy noted, that does depend a bit on exactly how the equipment's managed and used. So I guess just tightening down, make sure that that equipment is being used in the manner that Mr. Robertson assumes it will be.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But I don't think we would be able to come up with other mitigation measures ourselves.
But
Cool.
if I'm correct, the applicant isn't volunteering a construction noise and management plan because the standards are comfortably met or something along those lines. Could this be an occasion in your recommendation where if there was such a plan, it could include measures that are aimed at reducing impacts on animals? And rather than a rigid condition, which would be very hard to formulate, I would imagine, it could be addressed in a management plan. Would that be something that's important enough to include in such a plan, do you think?
I think given the concerns raised, I think it could be validly included. Or at the very least have some mechanism to try and minimise those effects in the conditions.
But just to be clear, that your recommendation was not to have a construction noise management plan. You're agreeing with the applicant that on the basis of the other effects and pile driving noise generally, there's no need for such a plan. But just to be clear, would you recommend that there should be such a plan that could build in controls such as impacts on dogs? Or have you not thought about that enough to answer right now?
I haven't thought about that enough to answer that.
All right, we might come back to that. Okay, thanks.
I'm glad to see that Helios is making a commitment to provide some annual community funding as laid out in paragraph 6.13 of Mr. Slicking's evidence. I still think that the benefits of the proposal don't have to fall on any particular party in order for the panel to approve the application. I still stand by those comments in my 42. But I do consider that provides a much clearer potential benefit to local communities from the proposal, which in my mind is a positive thing. I think it was Commissioner Day Cleveland asked about the possibility of including conditions related to community funding. In paragraph 124 of my 42A report, I concluded that the panel couldn't unilaterally require funding be provided, but given the applicant stated they're amenable to those sorts of conditions to that effect, I consider that point's been adequately resolved, obviously subject to the drafting of that condition. Finally, one of the concerns that came up yesterday in submissions was whether the battery storage would make a return. On Tuesday, I gave an initial indication that I felt the battery storage would require new consent under Rule 16.3.4 because it was related to a power generation facility. However, talking to one of my colleagues yesterday, we're no longer so sure that would be the case. So I'll just go through our reasoning for that before I finish up. 16.3.4, 13.6.4 relates to the construction and commissioning of power generation facilities, but it is oddly silent on upgrading of existing facilities. The BESS wouldn't be a power generation facility in its own right, so we were just thinking it may not fall under that rule unless the panel was willing to conclude that the construction of BESS, even after the solar farm is attached to is commissioned, should be considered construction and association subject to that rule. If the panel wishes, that's something we could seek further advice on. However, I just jumped down a little bit, sorry, Commissioners. Regardless of whether a rule in section 13 does apply, the original application notes that levels of, whether it's dimethyl carbonate from that storage, from the battery storage, would have breached the thresholds for hazardous materials listed in Schedule 19.14 of the district plan. That's on page 27 of the initial AEE, which I think is page 185 of the agenda. Specifically, it would be a class 3A flammable liquid in that schedule because it has a flash point of less than 23 degrees Celsius. In the rural resource area, any activity that uses over 5,000 litres of such a liquid would be a discretionary activity under Rule 4.7.42 of the district plan. So in the event that that section 13 wouldn't apply, I think that the provisions of the rural resource area will still adequately be able to manage the effects and the concerns that have been raised by submitters, particularly around potential contamination, potential hazardous materials. So to conclude that, overall, my conclusion remains the same.
So just so I'm clear, you're saying that consent would certainly be required for the hazardous substance element, but potentially not. So what about for this, the rest of the elements of the BES? Is that you're suggesting it may not need resource consent?
I'm suggesting that if section 13 can't be relied on, we'd be relying on the standards in section 4.
So why wouldn't, why wouldn't section 13 apply? This doesn't section 13 relate to network utilities?
So I had a look through the definition of network utilities in the RMA. It refers back to, in relation to, it relates to electricity distributors.
Yeah.
Which in this case, Helios wouldn't be. My understanding that's essentially
storage, effectively.
Yeah, because it's storage, it's not distribution of electricity. Like my understanding from reading the definitions is that those rules would apply to essentially lines companies or specific organisations that have been gazetted. So it wouldn't be a network utility. So it wouldn't be able to rely on those on the provisions in the plan that relates to network utilities. Like I think Ms. Grimmett mentioned yesterday, 20 metre squared buildings associated with network utilities. I don't think that rule could be relied on.
So therefore it would be rules under the rural resource area. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah. If we can't, if section 13 doesn't apply, you'd fall back to section 4.
And have you looked to see whether consent would be required under section 4?
So under section 4, a resource consent isn't required unless the plan specifically says. In this case, there would be pathways for the battery storage system to be installed as a permitted activity, in my opinion, under those rules. But one of the rules there limits storage. It limits the presence of hazardous materials. So for a storage system to be permitted, it would have to be setback off boundaries. It would have to comply with our colour palette, which so I don't.
That's okay.
That's one thing they've told, and they wouldn't be able to have large volumes of potentially flammable or corrosive or other types of materials there. There'd be limits set on that before which they need a consent.
Okay.
I did briefly discuss this with Ms. Bunheady, and we're both in agreement that the specific battery storage system that was initially proposed would require a resource consent.
Okay. Thank you.
And just before you move on, would that include a consideration of noise standards? Would they still apply if it's just a hazardous facility that's been assessed?
It would be subject to noise standards.
That applies to every activity, does it? Okay, thank you.
So overall, just wrapping up, my recommendation hasn't changed. It remains the same, that the proposal can be approved subject to appropriately worded conditions to manage the effects of the proposal that have been identified. That's all I had on those points. If the commissioners have any further questions.
Just one very quick one. We heard a lot of discussion yesterday about this being an industrial activity. I didn't get a chance to look up the definition of industrial activity in the plan. I wonder if you might be able to do that and advise us what that is, please.
Oh, I will do that right now. I have a funny feeling it won't be, but I'll have a quick look. So we do currently have a definition of industrial activity, but it only relates to residential zones at the moment. It came in recently through Plan Change 19.
Right.
So we don't have a definition in the plan that relates to industrial activities outside those zones.
Okay. So what, are you able to tell us what it is for the residential zone, just in case that helps?
Sure. And so in a residential zone means an activity that manufactures, fabricates, processes, packages, distributes, repairs, stores, or disposes of materials, including raw, processed, or partly processed materials or goods.
Okay.
So it's my take on that is it's primarily associated with manufacturing, distributing.
Yeah. And just to round that out, the way that this activity is provided for, can you just recap on that? I think it's in your 42A report, but in this zone, how is it classified in this zone?
So the power generation facility sits entirely within section 13, and that applies regardless of the zone that it's in.
Okay.
That section's intended to be its own.
So it's a power generation facility, and that's what this activity is.
Power generation.
So it is.
As the plan considered.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
I understand I understand why that connection was made.
Yes. Yes.
In terms of the district plan, it wouldn't be considered an industrial activity.
In terms of the plan. Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Thank you.
At paragraph 109 of your section 42A report, Mr. Vincent. Here you're making drawing some conclusions on risks to health and then later risks of soil or water contamination. So we did hear from submitters yesterday with regard to some concern about the composition of panels and also potential failure rates for those panels. And I noticed here at paragraph 109 that you were relying on the assessment of Ms. Rubio in relation to any particular panels. Could you confirm whether her assessment, the scope of her assessment extended to the composition of panels?
Not off the top of my head. That's something I'd have to dig back in and look.
Okay. All right. In my other question related to, we also heard from submitters around the cumulative impact given the Solar Bay development that's been consented in relation to rural character, amenity and landscape. Is that something you've specifically addressed in your assessment?
I don't think it was something I specifically addressed, but I think it's reasonable to say there will be a cumulative effect. Both facilities will be visible, particularly from Renfrew Naseby Road.
in the effect on specifically visual
That'll
or
be it.
amenity?
Primarily visual rural amenity. With Energy Bay, with the other solar farm, so for context, I was the reporting officer on that one as well.
Oh, okay.
I was, in that case, I was fairly satisfied that because of the location of it, quite a way step back off Renfrew Naseby Road on a road that has a much more industrial character. It's primarily used to access the Labs space radar, the Naseby substation, and Earnshaw 1's plantation forest. That sort of, in that context, it wouldn't have for notification, wouldn't have a more minor landscape effect. And there are a few other conditions in as well, which the applicant proposed around screening, which helped me make that decision. So
Was that application process non-notified?
that one was not notified. Yes. After quite a bit of wrangling, I must say.
Right, so just so that I'm clear, you do consider that there will be cumulative effect on visual and rural amenity from Naseby Renfrew Road?
Correct.
But no broader cumulative impact on?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No. And I'll add to that, that cumulative effect would also be most, again, while landscaping is established, becoming established.
Thank you.
It would reduce over time.
So you're saying there'll be an effect, what scale of effect?
I think that might be something that I want to check with the landscape experts about.
Well, we can ask them. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, report. Just relate to conditions.
Yeah, conditions. Yeah, that was all I had on those points. So,
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. What I think we'll do is we'll take a morning tea break now. We'll then hear from Mr. SB, then Dr. Wells, and then we'll have you back to deal with conditions. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So it's 10:20. We'll be back at 10:35.
Sorry, he might not have heard that. I've just unmuted.
Mr. SB, could you jump on and turn your camera on and so on? Yeah, the camera's there, but I'm looking there.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Yes. Excellent.
So what we'd like to do is if you would like to address us in any matters you think are important from your report or from the your listening of the hearing so far, very happy to hear that. And then we are likely to have some questions for you.
Yeah, yes, no problem. So
Yep.
my role was to peer review the landscape assessment work of Ms. McManaway. And she produced a landscape assessment report that was part of the application. And then she produced some further information in relation to a RFI request. And that included the landscape planting and maintenance plan, which gave some more detail on vegetation. Then also, of course, subsequent to my peer review, she produced her evidence, which we've heard. And I was present for the questions of her on Wednesday, I believe it was. And I should say, I also sat in for the applicant's council opening and various submitters, but not all of them. So I've been dropping in and out a bit, but I think I've covered the things that I need to cover. So essentially, Ms. McManaway's report assesses the effects of the proposal on landscape character and values and on views and visual amenity. And she describes those effects and comes to conclusions about the degree of effects and how they will evolve over time, and sets out a degree for the different types of effect. And really that's, of course, the purpose of a landscape assessment report. I don't want to oversimplify her report. There's a lot of description in there and a lot of analysis, but for the purposes of a quick summary, for now, I can cut to the chase. In a nutshell, in relation to effects on landscape values and landscape character, when we're assessing effects on landscape values are defined as the reasons a landscape is valued. So that's effects on landscape values, of which views and visual amenity is a subset. So effects on landscape values, I'm skipping to my peer review. You probably don't need to go to it, but I'm at my paragraph 28. Ms. McManaway finds a moderate adverse effect on the local landscape character and values, and a low effect on the broader Maniatoto Basin before mitigation planting establishes. Once mitigation vegetation becomes established, these adverse effects will reduce to low moderate adverse effect on landscape values for the local landscape and very low for the basin-wide landscape. So that's her findings on landscape values. Moving over to visual effects, obviously she assesses a bunch of viewpoints and roads and viewing experiences. I won't go through all those, but possibly the most relevant are Ranfurly-Naseby Road and Ranfurly Back Road, being the roads adjacent to the site. Ranfurly-Naseby Road, she finds adverse visual effects of adverse visual effects for observers on Ranfurly-Naseby Road, very low to moderate high during construction. So of course that depends where you are in Ranfurly-Naseby Road, but very low to moderate high, moderate adverse effect once construction is complete in terms of visual amenity from Ranfurly-Naseby Road, and then reducing to low moderate once planting is established. On that last point, I raised some questions about growth rates and establishment of vegetation and what have you, and that was clarified in response that when Ms. McManaway says established, that she's thinking of 5 years growth. And we heard some more information supplied about what 5 years growth means in terms of heights. So that's Ranfurly-Naseby Road. Skipping to Ranfurly Back Road, adverse visual effects on Ranfurly Back Road will be very low to moderate high during construction, moderate once construction is complete, and then reducing to low moderate once planting is established. So that's Ranfurly Back Road, which of course is currently more open, doesn't have the shelter belts and things that Ranfurly-Naseby Road does. There was a wee comment before, or a question before, about cumulative effects. Ms. McManaway does have a section on cumulative effects in relation to Solar Bay as well, and she finds cumulative effects will be up to a low moderate degree adverse cumulative effects. And that's in relation to the sort of Fennessy Road and Ranfurly-Naseby Road area at the north end of the site. So that's where, in a nutshell, Ms. McManaway ends up regarding degrees of adverse effect. through my peer review, I didn't take issue with her findings of degree. I thought she'd done the work and arrived at about the right ratings. I did raise some issues, as I say, to do with planting and some details and things which really probably go to conditions, extra information to be provided by conditions. That's probably all I was going to say in relation to my peer review. I'm happy to go to whatever questions or issues you'd like to look at.
Thank you. Some of the submitters yesterday, I don't know if you were there for them, mentioned concerns regarding landscape or visual effects of the solar farm when viewed from elevated viewpoints. Do you consider that the landscape assessment has suitably covered more distant elevated viewpoints in relation to the site?
Yes, Ms. McManaway had a number of viewpoints, and as far as sort of distant ones go, she had one. I went to all her various viewpoints. She had one at the start of Denzies Pass Road as it starts to rise up, and she had one on, or maybe she didn't have one, but I looked from Ridge Road.
Yes.
Which is, those two are to the east of the site, probably getting towards 5 kilometres from the site. So yeah, I certainly travelled around that area. To the east of the site, the land rolls up to some of these locations, such as Ridge Road, where you can get an elevated view. To the south of the site, we're onto the Maniatoto Plain, which is flat and actually falls to the south of it. So moving to the south of the site, you really don't get views. To the north of the site, you can get into the Ida range, of course, and go behind to the north of Naseby Township, and you start to get some elevation. There's the forest there, of course. You need to get out of the forest if you want an elevated view. If you keep going up into the Ida range, you can. My consideration was probably a good one is the Ridge Road viewpoint, which is I think 4.5 kilometres. She says her viewpoint is. You can start to get, the view is still quite horizontal, so you're looking very obliquely at the site, and therefore vegetation and things can get in the way. If you get right up into the Ida range, which I didn't do for the purpose of this assessment, I should say, but I have been there in the past, you start to get almost a bird's eye view over the northern Maniatoto, which reads as a flat valley floor with a patchwork of agricultural pattern over it. I would say, I can't remember her exact wording, but I think she found a low degree of adverse effect, dropping away to very low, depending on where you are in these very distant locations. I think that's fair, because after all, the exercise is not just to measure visibility and can you see the solar farm from these locations. If you're in these locations and you look in the right spot, you will see the solar farm.
Yes.
The exercise is, to what degree will that affect your amenity? And I think low to very low is fair on that. I think overlooking the Maniatoto Plain from up in the Ida Mountains somewhere, you have this very broad bird's eye view. It's not just the Maniatoto Plain you're looking at, of course. You're looking at all the skyline and the mountain ranges that form the horizon. And if you do focus on the plain, you see a patchwork of uses. And if as part of that patchwork, you see a solar farm 10 kilometres away, I think you could say that's a low degree of effect on your amenity.
Thank you. In terms of one of the concerns the neighbours have some of the submitters have raised relates to the idea that there has recently been a solar farm approved, obviously nearby the site. If this one was also approved, then obviously there's the cumulative impact of that, and you've touched on that. And then I think their follow-on concern is that there would be sort of that thin end of the wedge argument, you know, that this area becomes a sort of go-to for solar farms in the future. Now, part of my question is actually a sort of more of a planning one, which I forgot to ask Mr. Vincent before, but from a landscape perspective, what is my question? I guess, do you see a risk of a sort of substantive change from a landscape perspective within the Maniatoto if this were to be granted?
Well, I guess as far as a technical precedent situation goes, I'll leave that to others to talk about.
I suppose my question really is, if these two solar farms were built or consented and therefore become part of the existing environment, would it make it easier for applicants from a landscape perspective to get approval in the future, or in the corollary to that, would it make it harder for councils to decline it based on a sort of change that's occurred from a landscape perspective?
Well, I guess each application that comes along would still be assessed fully in terms of its individual effects. And we're thinking about this particular site here. Other sites might have quite different effects. Hypothetically, it's possible to put a solar farm somewhere where nobody can see it at all, I suppose, hypothetically. So each application is going to be quite different. So that's still going to be the main exercise, and assess the individual effects of an individual proposal, and some might be good, some might be bad. I suppose in a very broad sense, if a number of solar farms get approved in a particular area and they all get built, then that does become part of the landscape character for that vicinity. Yes. And if somebody was to do some sort of landscape character study, they might say, well, that area its character, at least in part, comes from solar farms. That's something for the future. I mean, I think we're a long way from that here, but I can see where you're going, I suppose that's as far as I can take it. If a number of solar farms get built, yes, they do start to become part of the character of a landscape. Yes,
thank you. That's very helpful. Mr. Vincent, can I ask you, so on that same vein, that some submitters have raised concerns that this becomes a sort of go-to for solar farms in the future that may be perceived as a positive or negative. But in terms of council's ability to independently assess and either grant or decline a case on its merits, do you think if we granted this application that there would be is there a precedent effect or precedent caused by granting this application?
I think for a start, I'd echo Mr. Espy's points that each one gets considered on its merits. I do think that there's an argument that could be raised that any individual activity that's consented slightly changes the character of the area. So there's always a balance there to be struck between how that creates, I guess, an expectation panels could be, that activity could be there, versus the cumulative impacts. And when do we say, yes, it's no longer achieving the immunity and the landscape values that we expect to see for that area?
Yes.
Obviously, I don't know when that threshold would be met.
It's sort of that tipping point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the argument.
Yes.
How I look at it.
Because it's a discretionary activity, what's your understanding about a sort of precedent in that case?
Generally about precedent?
Yes, for discretionary activities versus non-complying.
To be perfectly honest, I don't know. That's something I can have a bit more thought to if you want.
Well, given you have three planners on the panel, I think we've probably got our own thoughts about that, but, and no doubt that will be addressed in the, reply, but, no, I just wanted to check your view on that. So I think, no, that covers that point for me. Thank you.
I think the other thing to be aware of as well in terms of precedent is expectations in terms of process. We've looked at this application's gone through a notified, contested process.
Yes.
Given its effects, so I would say that kind of sets a bit of an expectation that if we were to get a similar size application in the future, it would go through a similar process.
So it sets an expectation, similar facts would be treated similar ways. Yes. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. SV. So there was some matters raised from submitters yesterday around a sort of I think if I understood it correctly, a claim that even though the site isn't within an ONL or a visual amenity landscape in terms of the district plan, there was some suggestion that the courts may have viewed this, not this particular site, but similar situations whereby you still need to take into account the outstanding natural values, or it sort of shouldn't be, the landscape shouldn't be split in terms of categories. Do you have a view on that point? Or let me know if you can expand on that.
The district plan does categorise landscapes into outstanding natural landscapes, significant amenity landscapes, and other landscapes. We're another landscape here, so we're outside of any significant amenity landscape or any outstanding natural landscape. So that, of course, affects what policies and objectives apply, landscape-related policies and objectives. And looking at Section 13 of the plan, which, as we've heard, is to be used as a complete code to deal with utilities and infrastructure.
Yes.
It's, I would say, informally speaking, it's pretty light on landscape, that section of the plan, and imagine that's intentional. It does have an objective and policies about outstanding natural landscapes in it, and those policies are about protecting the landscape. Then there's a policy that applies outside of outstanding natural landscapes, policy and objective, and it's about avoid, remedy, mitigate. So there's intentionally a different policy. I accept that, Section 7C about amenity values applies to every landscape, but we have to be guided by the district plan that has identified significant amenity landscapes, and then this isn't in one of those landscapes. So I'm not saying therefore you don't need to think about amenity values. Of course you do, and that's been part of Ms. McManaway's assessment and an important part. But there is a hierarchy of landscapes, and there is in many district plans. I suppose, come back to the point, that doesn't mean you disregard landscape effects. You don't. And so I agree with the submitters in that regard.
Yes. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. In terms of have you had a look at the back one? We heard quite a lot yesterday from submitters that they're concerned that the planting as proposed will struggle in this environment. I assume you're not able to give us advice about growth rates and things. That might be something Dr. Wells can help us with.
Yeah, that is something I raised in my peer review because, as I say, Ms. McManaway sets out the degree of effects, whether it's effects on landscape values or effects on visual amenity, and that this degree reduces over time, which is fair enough. And so I raised the point of, well, what about growth rates of plants and over what time will this reduction happen? Extra information came back on that point from in the form of the landscape planting and maintenance plan. from Boffimiscal, and also that was backed up by some review by Habitat Restorations Limited, who are an implementation company who do this sort of work. And that information, as I read it, endorsed Ms. McManaway's finding that after 5 years, planting will be starting to get to 2 to 3 meters high, such that it's above eye level of somebody on the road beside the site. And so it'll start to form a band, well, it will by that stage form a band that obscures view straight to the solar panels.
Are you talking in relation to Ranfurly Naseby Road and the exotic planting that's proposed along that boundary?
Well, and also along Ranfurly Back Road and the band of native planting that's proposed along there. So those documents that came back, as I say, came from Boffimiscal, also from Habitat Restorations. I understand Mr. Wells was also asked about it and confirmed plant growth rates. So I can't take that any further than that. That sounds right to me, and they've got more expertise in that than I do. So
no, no problem. So in terms of the conclusions that we can rely on in terms of landscape and visual impact, would you agree though that those conclusions do rely on the growth rates being as set out in that report, in those documents?
yes, timing wise, that's right.
Yeah, okay. Have you had a chance to look at the submission, the proposed conditions, particularly those attached to Ms. Panhetti's evidence?
Yes, I have, and I think it's largely condition 18 to do with landscape.
Mitigation plan, yes. Is there anything there that you would like to draw attention to? Are you comfortable with what's being proposed?
I did, in my peer review, mention that figures 7A to D of Ms. McManaway's report should be referred to in that condition. I think those figures are sort of little zoom-in plans of areas of the mitigation planting.
Oh, yes.
And I think they'd be very useful for somebody monitoring the condition to be able to refer to. And I would add that they haven't been updated.
Ms. Eastby, which figures were they? At A to D, did you say?
Sorry, if we go, it's in the graphic supplement of Ms. McManaway's report, and it's figures 7A to 7D. And so I think they should be referred to, but I think they also need updating because the landscaping has changed a bit since then.
Need updating in what respect?
They are zoom-ins of the original landscape mitigation plan that was attached to the original landscape assessment report, but then that plan was updated a bit in the RFI response information.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, understand. So your point is they need updating to reflect the latest landscape mitigation plan.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, and I think apart from that condition probably does the job because it refers to the landscape planting and maintenance plan. It refers to that in 18A1, Roman 1.
Yes.
And that's useful because that document contains more information that would be useful for monitoring conditions. And of course, this condition requires a final landscape mitigation plan to come back and a landscape management plan to come back. So I'd expect those documents to contain all the detail about plant numbers and densities and mixes and what have you.
Yes.
And so I think that's appropriate. grades, layout, I think it's all there.
Okay, thank you. And do you think, in terms of timing of the planting, and again, this might be a question for Dr. Wells, but from your perspective, the applicant has offered to essentially start planting when construction begins, and that they will have planting implemented before the solar farm becomes operational. Do you see any pros and cons in actually that planting starting earlier than that? Earlier than when construction starts?
Well,
From a landscape point of view, I appreciate there may be other reasons why that may not work, but.
yes, yeah, I heard the discussion on that, and as I understand it, the planting is to be done at the same time as construction, and then
Yes.
there are some areas that are given priority in terms of timing, so they might be planted in the first planting season, and then other planting after that. It might take 2 or 3 planting seasons to get all this planting done, and that happens during construction. Now, I suppose in very broad terms, the sooner you put plants in, the better, because you'll get more growth. But then things have to be practical as well. You know, in a hypothetical sense, consent conditions might say, look, you've got to do all your perimeter planting, and then only once that planting is 3 meters high can you build your solar farm. I think we might start to contemplate conditions like that if there was a policy somewhere that said avoid visual effects of solar farms. But there's no policy that says that. The policy is avoid, remedy, mitigate. So to my mind, planting the plants during construction, and then over the next 5 years, those plants incrementally screening the solar farm as growth occurs, and then beyond 5 years, really becoming a complete ban. To me, that's mitigating. That's reducing effect over time. It's not avoiding, but it's mitigating.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Have you had, you've obviously been involved in this area, etc., Otago, Queenstown, and so on for some years, some decades. What have you been involved in projects where it might have a similar sort of landscape value and similar potential landscape effect, where it has been required to start planting prior to construction? Can you think of any examples where that has been imposed?
Well,
or where you might have recommended that?
I think that is the situation with the Solar Bay solar farm. I think there's a condition there that says planting has to be a certain height before you put in the panels. It's a much smaller operation, of course.
Were you involved in that process?
No, I wasn't. No, I just recall reading that condition somewhere. But yes, I have come across consents where planting is required to reach certain heights before something can be built. The ones I'm thinking of, I've never come across one on a very large scale. It's normally for something smaller, like let's say an individual building, and it's normally to do with a specific view, you know, a specific viewpoint, and you know, a certain clump of planting has to reach a certain height, and then X, Y, Z can happen. So it's the ones that I'm aware of are more confined and precise in terms of what has to be achieved.
Yes, and would they generally be where it might be a more sensitive landscape visually, such as an ONL or something like that, or not necessarily?
Yes, I'd say that's correct. Yep.
Yeah. Cool. You don't know. I think we've got some other questions for you. Thanks, Mr. Eastby.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eastby. We also heard from a submitter yesterday who suggested that bunding would be an appropriate mitigation around the site to manage the adverse effects on landscape values and visual amenity.
Is that something that you have considered? Were you tuning in, listening to that presentation yesterday?
Yes, I heard that submission, yes.
Yes. Do you have any comment or views on that as a suggestion?
Well, bunding, of course, creates sort of a complete screen as soon as you build the bunding. It also screens noise, which planting doesn't, but I don't know about noise. I suppose my thought on that is that part of the nature of this activity is that it is reversible. In a broad sense, the solar farm is removable in the long run. I don't know how long, but it is removable, and it's not like an open cast mine or something. It's not something that alters the landscape and then that can never be repaired. Whereas I would say if you start building 3-metre high bunds all along the road, then you're getting into the territory of permanently changing the landscape in a way that's not going to be reversed. And I think it's more. I think that would be using mitigation in a way that is more contrary to the existing landscape character than planting is.
Okay, thank you for that. And just earlier, you were referring to section 13 of the plan and the key objective and policies that you have used to guide your assessment of the peer review. So can I just check with you exactly what objective you're referring to? Is that objective 13.3.5, landscape and amenity value?
Yes, that's right. That's the objective, and I'm just looking at it here. And above that, you can see there's one about outstanding natural landscapes, which isn't us.
Yes, that's right. And then
yep.
the policy that you referenced earlier.
Yes, that is. It's policy 13.4.7, and it's D of that.
So there's no specific policy for other landscapes that it's just this policy here. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all questions for you, Mr. Espy. Thank you very much for your report and for answering our questions.
Thank you.
If you're able to hang around just for we probably won't be too much longer, just in case we have anything else we need to pop back to you on.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you. Dr. Wells.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear. Thank you. Thank you for your report. If you could do something similar to Mr. Espy, just run us through the high notes of your work you've done and comments that came out of the last couple of days of the hearing, that would be helpful, and then we'll have some questions for you.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go quite quickly through the review, seeing it's fairly straightforward. So I undertook a peer review of the ecological report that Boffa-Miskell prepared, but also of the landscape management components of the landscape plan, specifically relating to species selection and growth rates. I undertook a site visit on the 17th of June 2025. That was over a 6-hour period. I was accompanied by one of the landowners for 2 hours, and then I spent 4 hours by myself going to areas of particular interest that I'd observed with the landowner. Then the review of the fauna aspects was based on a desktop as well, and that was assisted by some of my colleagues from Wildlands who have specialist expertise in fauna. I've also read the evidence from Dr. Morris, Dr. Seavright, and Ms. McManaway, and I've also been in the hearing. I was on site in Ranfurly Tuesday, Wednesday. Just a bit of background there. So now just to go through I'll just touch very briefly on the key points of my peer review. In general, I consider the ecological assessment to be thorough, It uses appropriate methods. I believe it reaches valid conclusions regarding ecological values, ecological significance, level of effects, and mitigation, proposed mitigation. So I won't touch in detail on those. I'll just take them as given. I'll just touch now on the key differences in my assessment compared with Bopper-Miskell's. We're probably well aware of these, so I'll just highlight them. The first was Indigenous annual plants may have been missed due to the timing of the primary plant survey during June of 2023. There was also potential lizard habitat in shelter belts, which wasn't highlighted in the Bopper-Miskell assessment. Thirdly, the issue of wetland setbacks of 10 metres or 5 metres for the smaller wetlands. On that, I considered that potentially a 10-metre setback would be more appropriate in light of potential effects on avifauna. Fourthly, screen planting. The proposed growth weights, in my opinion, are likely to be more variable than outlaid in the landscape management plan, and I note that there's quite a likelihood of an average lower growth over a 5-year period. However, that would be expected to reach heights in a slightly longer period. The fifth point was regarding the plantings in general, the indigenous vegetation plantings in general, that if removed after the 35-year consent period, then there could actually be a loss of the values through the proposal, and that I recommended that these areas be maintained beyond the 35-year time period, including the wetland stock exclusion. And I suppose my particular concern was there, if we're replacing double the number of plants removed as part of the mitigation, then at minimum those plants should be retained beyond the 35 years, because otherwise there will be there'll be removal of plants for the solar farm, and there needs to be retention of at least those double number of plants. But overall, I agree with the Bopper-Miskell report that there's a very clear ecological gain from the proposed measures. No doubt about that. I'll just quickly now cover off the comments I've heard during the hearing. I guess some of these differences have been resolved for me through the evidence of Dr. Morris and Ms. Seivwright, and also the discussions during the hearing have helped to bring clarity to me in some of those points. Firstly, regarding avifauna, it's become clear to me that through Doc's input and the extra discussions that were held, that the approach to avifauna, particularly the collision risk, is a conservative approach, and I trust the input of Department of Conservation working with Ms. Seivwright in that regard. Moving on to wetland setbacks, given the extra input provided from evidence and from Department of Conservation's working with Bopper-Miskell, I agree with Dr. Morris's evidence and questioning that there's no clear ecological rationale. That I agree with him that after the additional information that I've heard, there's no clear ecological rationale for larger setbacks on those wetlands from 5 metres. The key things that could have been concerns other than avifauna are obviously shading, sedimentation, and changed hydrological regime. I don't think they apply, and now that I'm satisfied about the avifauna collision risk, I'm satisfied from an ecological perspective that a 5 metre is appropriate for those smaller ephemeral wetlands. My only possible caveat on that would be there could still be some value for the few wetlands which are mapped as having indigenous vegetation present. Although, again, I'd be happy to accept a 5 metre regardless. Moving on.
Just hold a mo. We've got a question on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wells. So on that, just so that we're clear, you're comfortable with a 5 metre setback, but at the same time, you're not comfortable?
I'm comfortable that the avifauna collision risk factor, the additional evidence and discussion that I've heard satisfies me that the conservative approach has been applied even with a 5-metre setback in terms of avifauna collision risk, which was the main concern expressed in my peer review. What I then added on, which may not have been clear, is that some of those small wetlands are mapped as containing indigenous vegetation. And so I was just raising that there could possibly be an argument made that a larger setback would benefit indigenous vegetation. However, that I appreciate that that's been considered by Dr. Morris, and as he notes in his evidence, in my peer review, I noticed that there could be merit in considering some of those things, and so I do appreciate that Dr. Morris has considered that. And I think I land on all of that I am comfortable even in those wetlands with indigenous vegetation with a 5-metre setback. So that probably clarifies my previous comment.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. So overall, for all wetlands on the site, you're now comfortable that the key issues have been resolved in relation to?
Yes, as long as, bear in mind that the central and the southwest retain the need for a 10-metre setback. I continue to agree with that's important.
That's right, but for all of the smaller ones, you are now comfortable?
Yes,
Thank you.
correct.
Thank you.
Just so in terms of the lizard habitat, Dr. Morris's evidence has clarified that issue in my peer review, that at the time I was unclear whether those shelter belts would remain, and they will remain, so the internal shelter belts. So that has, I'm now comfortable that the effects on lizards have been dealt with adequately. So maybe if I just, before you send questions my way, also maybe in regards to the plantings.
Sorry, just before you do that, Dr. Wells, just so I'm clear, in terms of the key differences, you referred to the Indigenous Annual Plant Survey. Did you want to update us on your view whether that's necessary?
Yeah, no, thanks for the reminder. That's an important one. So again, Dr. Morris in his evidence provides very important additional information. In my original peer review, it seemed that the plant survey was entirely done in June 2023, with the October survey only being wetland delineation. However, Dr. Morris has clarified that during the October survey, there was searching undertaken in ephemeral wetland and wetland margin grasslands for indigenous spring annuals, and I understand that was done by, I think it was Ms. Schlutz from memory, who I appreciate is a very experienced botanist. Now, so that alleviates my concerns. That was important additional information which was not clear in the original Boffa-Miskell report. I also, in questioning, I note that Dr. Morris then also stated that the general pasture areas were not specifically searched for spring annuals, and the reason being that they were considered to have no suitable habitat for spring annuals. Now, I agree with him on that point as well. The particular areas where I think spring annual surveys were required was in those areas of favourable habitat within and on the margins of the ephemeral wetlands. So I'm satisfied that there's no need for a spring annual survey. I think the additional information about the October survey satisfies me that that's been well covered.
Thank you. So you were going to talk about screen planting and growth rates.
Yes, so in my peer review, page 15, I know I make some comments regarding growth rates based on Appendix 1 from the landscape management plan. And I
So is
note
that
there
in-
that
So is that in section 4.0, summary and conclusions?
the paragraph above that, sorry, the very top of that page,
Great, thank you.
paragraph 1 of page 15.
Thank you.
So I note there in the second sentence that growth rates can be highly variable in Central Otago, and I think that's probably that remains one of my concerns. Is you can achieve the rates provided in Appendix 1 of the Landscape Management Plan. However, in practice, there is often great variability, and it can be quite difficult to predict prior to planting, and it can depend on just how plants happen to take, how the following season, following planting, actually unfolds in terms of wind and rain and out of season frosts, and also just variation in soil, micro soil patterns. And so from my experience, well, I've lived in the Upper Clutha Basin for 35 years and also worked in the ecological realm in the high country for a lot of that time, and observed Plantings Wildlands has a restoration wing which undertakes large Indigenous restoration plantings, including in some high country areas. And I've personally established on an acre of land in Central Otago Indigenous plantings, and so reasonably experienced. I would caveat that by saying I haven't personally observed plantings within the Maniatoto plain itself, although I have within places nearby, similar climates. And I've noticed that there's a variability, and it can be very hard to predict. So I suppose I have a little, maybe I'm just presenting a weak caution from my experience that often it's a little more patchy than hoped. Now, I think establishment of 80% can be quite happily obtained. I'm very comfortable with that, as long as the appropriate management measures proposed are undertaking. So that's just a wee caution there. I do also I noticed there's been some discussion around irrigation. During the hearing, it was unclear to me whether there would continue to be irrigation offered or whether crystals would be used. I do think that, from my experience, irrigation provides a very important part of plant establishment in these environments, but particularly in order to obtain reasonable growth rates. Without irrigation, I would definitely have reasonable level of uncertainty that the expected growth rates would be obtained. They may be obtained if you happen to get some good damper springs and summers, but I would think there'd be, in my mind, a degree of uncertainty around those outcomes.
Thank you. Have you had any experience with the crystals as referred to by the applicant team?
Yes, I personally haven't used them, but Wildlands has used them in a number of projects in drier climates, particularly inland Canterbury, and they are well recognised as providing benefits in terms of water availability and retention. But as they are always shall we say, they're desirable for sites where irrigation is difficult or practically not possible to achieve. Obviously, the ultimate is irrigation. Well, where that's not able to be applied, crystals provide an alternative.
And is it, based on your knowledge, would you expect plant growth rates to be less or more variable if you're using crystals as opposed to irrigation?
I think, no, I could confidently say that irrigation is the option that provides the greatest likelihood of consistently good growth rates. Crystals are a less certain alternative from my experience. Again, we're talking about in dry climates here. Yeah, applicable to the site in question.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, just very quickly, Dr. Wells, we heard yesterday the NPSIB is not strictly applicable to this proposal because it's a renewable energy generation project, but that the applicant has nevertheless followed that methodology, the fixed management hierarchy. And is that your understanding? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree that, yeah, I think they've followed that fixed management hierarchy, yes.
Right. So in terms of the avoid part of it, you're satisfied that they've avoided those effects were practicable. Is that the sort of test, or how do you understand that avoid aspect of it?
Yeah, I think avoid is, to me, you avoid where possible, and in this case, I think if we say the key ecological value to be at this site is the wetlands. I don't think there's any dispute between Dr. Morris and I in that regard, and then also the scattered indigenous shrubs. So I think the applicant has rightly chosen avoidance for wetlands, which I think is a very important step, and I fully agree that that is a necessary avoidance measure. When it comes to the other key ecological value on site, which is shrubs, I think it's avoidance is not possible in that regard because you would be having a extremely difficult time designing your layout of solar panels around those shrubs. But also, one of the observations while I was on site, which was quite striking to me, was the extremely challenging environment for these remnant shrubs and the very, very poor condition of most of them. In fact, some of the shrubs that Dr. Morris had mapped along fence lines took me quite a while to find. And when I did find them, finally I found out why they were hard to find, and that's because they'd basically been chewed down to a 10-centimetre stump above ground, so that the actual shrub which Dr. Morris had seen had obviously been eaten over. And so I think that was very typical of what I saw on the site. And so the avoidance of those shrubs to me is, number one, I can't imagine it would be easy practically from a solar farm design, but also ecologically, I don't see that as a priority. I think the mitigation measures proposed by Dr. Morris in terms of doubling the number of plants and also fencing areas, I don't doubt at all that the mitigation provides a very, very clear net gain. So that's right. So I think they've followed well through the avoid and then into the mitigate.
So that goes back to the purpose of the NPSIB, the net gain. That's how you've arrived at that. Thank you. That clarifies very much.
I have one further question for you, Dr. Wells, and I was just trying to find the name of the firm that did the peer review or provided some additional advice to Dr. Morris in terms of planting species and growth rates in the Maniatoto. You mentioned that firm when you spoke earlier. Can you remind me?
Habitat Restorations.
That's it, thank you. We haven't heard from them directly. There's no evidence from them for us to consider. Are you aware of that company? Do you know who they are?
Yes, I have heard of them. I do know my understanding is they have been working in the Tairi project, but that's as far as my understanding goes. I haven't personally worked with them in a professional capacity, and I haven't seen any of their correspondence regarding this application either.
Right, okay, thank you, that's fine. Yeah, in terms of conditions, so, have you had a chance to look at the recommended conditions that were attachment A to Ms. Van Heedy's evidence?
I have read them briefly and obviously heard discussions during the hearing. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I don't need you to go through them now in detail, but essentially, I just wanted to double check with you. There was from the 42A report, there was that recommendation around further survey work, and you've covered that off, saying you don't think that's necessary, so that's been deleted. And then there are the avifauna conditions around literature review, bird monitoring plan, bird collision management plan, which I think you've said you've sort of respected that work with between DOC and the applicant team. We then have the wetland enhancement plan. Again, I think DOC was involved in that condition. And I think that's all around ecology. Are you comfortable that the matters you consider important to be managed during the implementation of this consent are covered in the conditions in relation to ecology?
Yes, I'm very happy with the additional avifauna conditions. I think are sound, and I support them.
Yes.
The wetland enhancement, yes, I note in the management plan there's mention of 3,100 plants proposed within the wetland, scattered in a scattered planting arrangement. I agree with that approach. The only thing I would say that, relating back to one of my earlier comments, which I would think would provide certainty of the long-term mitigation, would be that at least part of those planting areas are retained following the expiration of the consent in 35 years. That relates back to one of my previous concerns regarding if all of the Indigenous plantings were removed at the end of that time. I think there needs to be some condition to ensure that at least the mitigation plantings for the loss of high value shrubs through the development, that at least that, and Dr. Morris refers to a double of those key species, and he gives a number. So I think the easiest way to me for a condition would, rather than be there must be X hundred plants at the end, it would be to actually have an area,
so a
of
square
ground.
meter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a square meterage or whatever, which corresponds to more than those plants that Dr. Morris refers to, which is conditioned to remain even after the decommissioning of the solar farm.
Why would they need to? Why would that square meterage need to be more than the area Dr. Morris has recommended?
Oh, well, no, Dr. Morris recommends at least a double the number of plants. So what I'm saying is that could prove difficult to implement, having to go around and count the number of desert brooms that were going to be retained, and the number of matagari. And so I was just thinking a more pragmatic condition might be to determine an area which would ensure that that number of plants was retained following the decommissioning of the solar farm.
And is it your view that the area should correspond to that doubling figure or the figure of removal?
I think to ensure again, following through the effects management hierarchy, to ensure a net gain, I would be advocating for a doubling. And also the reason for the doubling, as outlined in my peer review, is that the removal of the shrubs will happen instantly, and so that will remove invertebrate habitat, etc. And so to account for that, you generally have to have a mitigation measure which is more than you've removed to allow for that time lapse before the shrubs grow up.
Yes, but does it need to be double, I guess is what I was trying to get to. Does it have to be the full amount of mitigation planting as proposed by Dr. Morris that would have to be retained? It may be that the applicant comes back to us and says this is all fine, they're happy to do all this, but just in case they don't.
Well, yeah, well, I
trying
think to be consistent,
that would need to be, yeah,
to be consistent with the effects management approach that I've assessed, then I would say yes, it would have to be according to what's been proposed in Dr. Morris's report of, you know, double the number of plants lost. Yes.
Okay.
And I would suspect that would be very, very straightforward for the applicant to achieve, because their plantings that they're proposing are extremely large scale in comparison to that.
Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you. Yes. No, thank you very much for your report and for your words this morning and for answering our questions. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Right. So we'll now go to conditions. So if we go back to your speaking notes from this morning, is that the best? And then I also have in front of me the recommended conditions attachment A to Ms. Unheady's report. So that about right for us for this juncture?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So just to be clear, whenever I'm referring to condition numbers, it's as per just my heady's attachment. So unless I say it to us.
Excellent. Thank you.
I did actually make sure to do that in this case.
Yeah, that's great. It can get very confusing about which version. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so
sorry, we might just turn our heater off. It's cooking in here. Okay.
Okay, so in relation to condition 1 and the other conditions where there's just been recommendations to swap out different plan references, I'm okay with those.
Yes.
In relation to the conditions about management plans, what their contents are, how they're certified, etc. Just speaking from experience, our monitoring team normally prefers to be able to see everything needed to comply with the condition in that condition, just so they're not having to jump around between different conditions. So I've got a preference, based on that, I've got a preference that each condition essentially be self-contained, so it has its own time limit, content requirements, etc., even if that does result in a little bit of double up. That said, provided the conditions are drafted in a way that's clear about what requirements and timeframes apply to each plan, I'm more than happy for that to be the case. And in the panel's direction, I'm quite happy to work through that, exactly how those look with Ms. Heating.
So just so I'm clear, you're talking about conditions which require preparation and certification of management plans.
Correct.
And the content of those plans, what they need to achieve and timeframes and things. Your council's general preference is to have them separately, because my experience with big projects is that it's very cumbersome given the number of management plans. And generally, my experience is that you would have sort of high level conditions first that say, here's the list of management plans that need to be prepared, this is the time frame, and then within the individual. But
that's,
I think
it's completely reasonable. I think either way,
as long as
either way on.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
For condition 4 and the duration of the consent, I'm okay with that being linked to the operational period of the facility. I'm pretty happy that 35 years from the date that electricity is first sold to the grid is sufficiently certain that it's going to limit, sufficiently certain to limit the duration of the consent. I do think that the panel should give some consideration to whether linking the duration of consent to that point could have any other implications. For example, in this case, the consent will commence before its duration is known. And I haven't fully worked through it, but I think the consent would probably be considered given effect to before the facility started selling power. So again, before that duration was actually known.
And do you mean because the date, operational date, wouldn't be known yet, and therefore you don't 35 years, right?
So, yeah, so I guess to that point, that could, and this is very much a could, result in the facility being there longer than the experts who presented may anticipate. So it could have slightly longer duration effects. Unless there was some agreement that the consent would be given effect to at that time it was generating power. That makes sense. It's not necessarily the most clear way to.
I think I understand your point. What I'm thinking about is how important is the 35 years? I don't think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I heard any evidence from experts who were saying after 35 years the effects will become unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we're not entirely sure where the 35 years comes from, other than the applicant is saying that the general lifespan of the facility is likely to be 35 years. But my read is that it's not an effects trigger, it's more a operational matter. So if it does end up being longer in total than 35 years, does that matter from an effects management perspective?
So my reading from the application is that obviously the panels would be removed at end of life, which the application's assumed to be 35 years, and that assumption's underlaid all the assessments that were done after that.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily an effects question, it's potentially more of a scope question. Is the assumption being made that the application would, the facility would last 35 years? Does that assumption you remove that assumption, how does that affect the evidence that's been presented?
Okay, so you're suggesting that perhaps you and Ms. Van Hedy have a bit of a discussion about the detail around that condition and the workability of it, is that? Yeah, okay.
And I think the last point I had was agree with the suggestion from the applicant. I think it was the applicant that there be a requirement to the consent holder let council know when their date is, just so we can keep our records up to date. And there's no argument down the line.
Thank you.
Let me get a bit to condition 9, specifically 9F, in relation to the suggested removal of the monitoring condition. Given the concerns raised by the submitters, I think it's reasonable to assume that some monitoring of noise would be required. Even if that condition wasn't there, I'd still expect that CODC would undertake some monitoring of construction noise just to make sure that everything was being complied with. So I guess that's to say I'm not opposed to that condition being removed, but it's just an indication that there would still be some monitoring done even if that condition wasn't there. And reflecting on it, there's probably some benefits to having CODC do that monitoring themselves regardless.
So yeah, normally in a condition which requires monitoring, it's the consent holder's, job to do that monitoring. And are you saying that actually it would be more appropriate for council to do that as part of its general compliance?
Yeah, I think it would be.
Yes. And do you think is it appropriate to have a condition that refers to that, or would that not be appropriate?
I don't think it would be strictly necessary because we've, like, CODC still got a statutory obligation to monitor this concern.
Yes.
I think it'll be sufficient sort of in this instance that the applicants essentially require notice that that's something we will be looking at. And I think given the concerns raised by the submitters, I think that's entirely reasonable.
Yes, so just going back to that earlier question I put to you about the effect on the dogs during construction, that there is a requirement for construction management plan, and it does deal with construction noise, doesn't it? Because there's the E, and that's to show how noise limits for construction standards and the standard NZS standard will be complied with. Would that be an appropriate place if we thought fit to include some sort of provision for the effects on animals, for instance, to be included? Would that be the place to include it? Because there's no condition dealing with ongoing noise management plans, just the construction noise.
Just construction, yes, I think it would be.
Yeah. Have you given any more thought to that question I asked about whether that's appropriate to include in here based on the submissions we heard?
I'm just trying to work it through with construction standards that assume human hearing.
That's right. Or is it
I did say I don't think there's a lot of scope to consider those effects.
Well, we can certainly consider those effects, but are you saying in terms of a condition that would work? Is that your reservation, or it's for us to decide whether we should include it or not? But from a planning point of view, is it something that you see difficulties with including in a management plan type condition? Or would you like to come back to us on that?
Personally, I don't see anything, but I can definitely let you know if something comes up.
All right.
I just haven't had a chance to do that.
Thank you.
Through conditions in 2013, no particular issues with those. Three, that the removal of condition 11 from my 42 report is fine because that was essentially double up with the construction management plans. For condition 17, I've already covered this where I prefer the original reading of that condition from my report. Even if the panel's happy with consenting with a condition with a reduced setback, I'd still prefer the condition specify what setbacks are required from what wetlands rather than referring back to the ecological assessment. Just helps me applying that condition a little clearer in my opinion.
Clearer from what perspective? Or from
the
consent holder or the monitoring?
Both.
Both.
Just in terms of what's required to be done.
So I'm clear, condition 17, your view is that it's more appropriate to use the wording that you included in your 42A report, which refers to essentially 10 metres setback from all natural wetlands unless consent is granted by Otago Regional Council.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Had you considered whether that's a component of that could be included as an advice note? That other consents may be required? Sometimes an advice note can serve a good purpose.
Yeah, I think if the panel's happy with the condition saying 5 metres and enforcement would be fine.
Well, the evidence we've got is that 5 metres is appropriate.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, that was essentially just a technical thing to try and avoid any influence in overseas instances.
Yes.
So it's,
Yeah. Oh, we'll consider that. Just from a practicality point of view, and Ms. Bent, he might like to think about this, if we were specifying sort of 5 metres, 10 metres in the condition, is it clear? Is it easy to identify which wetlands would be being referred to? Presumably that's why there was a recommendation around the impact assessment reference, but I understand your point that it would be clearer to specify the setbacks.
I think in that context, you would have a condition that says 5 metres from the specific named wetlands in the ecological report, and then 5 metres off.
List them all.
There's only 2, so it would be relatively straightforward to list the 2 wetlands that have the 5 metre setback. The 10 metre setback, the central and the south eastern wetland.
So, and then the 5 metre,
And then 5 metre from the other wetlands.
It's identified in the plan or something.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Quickly on touching on condition 18, it's largely based off Dr. Wells, but I do consider the irrigation should be provided to maximise growth rates, and frankly, the longer it's available, I think better.
Sorry, start again on that bit. Condition.
So condition 18,
Yes.
A2.
Yes.
I consider the irrigation water should be used in the first instance to maximise growth rates, and the longer it's available, the better. I think initially I'd said have irrigation water available for 5 years. The applicant suggested 2 years plus, if required, during dry summer periods for up to 5 years.
Yeah, actually,
my preference would be to have a definitively available for a long period. It's 2 years.
Dr. Wells, are you still with us?
Yes, still here.
Excellent, thank you. Are you following on with this conversation? And I don't know if you've got the conditions in front of you, or you could have a look at those.
I haven't got them in front of me just now.
Okay, so there's a condition proposed which requires the final landscape management plan. And we're just discussing the issue of what information needs to be included in it relating particularly to irrigation. The applicant has suggested this is information to include in the landscape management plan, details of irrigation or water retention provision for 2 years after the implementation, and availability if required through dry summer periods up to 5 years after implementation. So that's the applicant's recommendation. We're just hearing from Mr. Vincent that I'm paraphrasing, I think you're saying that you think there needs to be certainty about water irrigation or water retention tools up to 5 years, rather than saying if required. So do you have a view on that, Dr. Wells, about whether certainty of water provision is required for 5 years or 2 years? Do you have a view on that?
I think this is my experience from Central Otago and Mackenzie country type environments, is that 2 years is great to ensure high survivorship of plants. But if the aim is to achieve ongoing rapid early growth, then water becomes quite important up to that 5-year period. So in this context, given that the plantings are reasonably crucial for mitigation of landscape effects, I think I'd be tending to think that 5 years of available water would best allow that to be achieved.
Thank you.
One other thing I forgot to mention in our previous talk as well was I did notice that the no exotic species have been proposed as part of the mitigation plantings along the Ranfurly back road, and I do know that it's not uncommon practice to sometimes put in a temporary row of exotics which are fast growing, and that then those are later removed after 5 or 7 years. So just put that in as well, that was something I discussed with Mr. Vincent yesterday actually, but I just overlooked to mention it earlier.
Right, and okay, thank you. Yep.
Great.
Yeah, just a moment.
So in terms of the wording promoted by the applicant, where it says details of irrigation or water retention, is your view that it should not be an either or? Are you saying that you favour irrigation supply only?
Yeah, I definitely favour irrigation supply. I would say, again, this is my personal view, not speaking from the area of planning expertise necessarily, but from what I've heard so far this week, the use of water retention crystals ought to only be a last resort if no other option is available.
Right, and it's based on listening to Dr. Wells' evidence as well.
Yes.
So how would something like that be phrased in a condition?
I think it could be along the lines of the consent holder being required to provide details of irrigation, and then essentially an if clause that if no practical irrigation can be found, or at least if sufficient irrigation can't be found, then these could be used in those specific circumstances.
Right.
Have the circumstances
Right.
described in the condition.
Actually, sorry, that just reminds me of a question. Dr. Wells, there was one of the submitters yesterday suggested to us that there may be some risk to in terms of contamination from the use of the water crystals. Do you have any knowledge of whether that's a likely issue?
I can't actually speak to that with certainty because I'm unfamiliar of the chemical composition.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
that's not very useful. Sorry, but
No, that's fine.
I know that Wildlands uses them regularly and consistently
Yes.
in all sorts of settings, but I'm not able to comment on exactly what they're made of. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, could I ask? Quiet, thank you. Thank you. Oops. Okay, thank you.
So final question, replacement planting, that's Roman numeral V1 or 6. It's not a condition, it's something that's built in consideration for the plan. One of the considerations is replacement planting with evergreen species where there are gaps or where there are trees that are failing and need to be removed. In your experience, how is that interpreted? Does that mean that a 3-year-old tree will be replaced with a 3-year-old tree, or does it go back to a small tree that's got more chance of survival? What does it mean in practice, do you think?
My understanding would be that it would get replaced with a smaller tree.
Right, so there could be potential differences in height with replacement trees. Okay, all right, just so I understand that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Jumping ahead to condition 19, I think implemented in that condition. So that's talking about landscape management plan being implemented before the farm's operation. I think that would probably be best corrected to saying that essentially the planting is complete before the farm's operational, and I think there's some discussion about the trigger for that, and I agree that it should be essentially the same point as condition 4, where it's operational at the point it's selling power.
So do you, something like the planting required by the certified final landscape management plan must be implemented before the solar farm is operational, or something like that, really?
Yeah, see, like maybe switch implemented with completed.
Yes.
As in plants in the ground.
The plant, yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
For condition 20, I'm okay with the inclusion of a threshold beyond which plants need to be re-established. So that's the 80% threshold. But I think it could be made a bit clearer that it should refer to 80% total, not say, for example, 80% per annum. For example, if 15% of the plants die in 1 year and then 15% die in the next, 15% of the remainders die in the next year, that should be considered a 72 more or less % survival rate, which I think should be compensated through replanting.
Is that a little easy for us to word a condition in that way if we were minded to? How would you change the words to make it clear that it achieves what you're wanting it to achieve? Anyway, come back to us if you like, but it currently just says 80%. Yeah.
I'd imagine it's something along the lines of like a total of 80%, or have it be some reference to gross, but that's something we can do through.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah.
So condition 21, my initial drafting of that condition was intended to apply to the spring plantings along Renfrew-Naseby Road in order to ensure the full, like there was full screening of that, there was screening that side of the facility. My reading of that condition was that it would also apply to the shelter belts within the site.
I was just thinking that too. So all shelter belts.
Yeah. I'm not opposed to that. The applicant's more than welcome to clarify that if they want to in their reply. But when I was thinking about it, something I did think was those internal shelter belts do help screen the views from the south as well. So
yeah,
it's not something I'm going to say I think the panel should require those shelter belts to be maintained to a certain height. But just to let you know, there could be something else in there as well.
Can I ask you, is it your intention that that condition relates to all shelter belts existing and proposed on the site?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of what we've changed is so that it does
Do that.
apply to
That
all
is the
shelter belts, whereas the original wording, it was just on that one.
Okay, thank you.
For that, the unnumbered condition after 21, which relates to the pretty development. Just happy with that list of structures that the applicants included there. Just one one thing I want to double check, this is from my understanding. The use of inverter skids is intended to include the entire inverter structure, not just the bit where it touches the ground. That's just from my own understanding. I might be getting things wrong.
That's the whole.
Good to know. I just wasn't sure. I talked to our building control and they think skids are a very specific thing.
We can certainly look at the drafting of that, just to make
Yeah.
sure it's clear from a compliance perspective.
Thank you. Just while we're looking at those conditions, I wonder, so conditions 18 through to 22 all relate to the landscape and visual effects management.
Mhm.
So that's fine. There's a heading that does that. I'm wondering whether 21, and this might be for Ms. Barnheady, just relation to what we were just talking about, the all shelter belts. Just for certainty, whether it should refer to shelter belts, shown on the landscape mitigation plan. It's just so that in case in the future someone grows another one or something, and then there's argument about whether that needs to be maintained to a 3 metre height.
One point on that, if I may.
Yes.
My reading of that management plan says it has 2 specific shelter belts that management plan identifies as being kept to 3 metres. 2 of the new ones on the northwestern corner, but doesn't actually point to the other ones. So I agree that that's a good idea. Well,
I'll leave that to you to think about. It's just being clear about which shelter belts you're referring to. Oh, thank you.
For conditions 24 to 30, so the open fauna conditions, they've all been agreed between the applicant and DOC, and essentially built on my proposed conditions 26 to 27. I'm pretty happy with those conditions. I think Commissioner Ray, you asked whether the advice notes there should be elevated to a condition. I just reiterate that I agree with Ms. Manhetti. There's a few references in the advice notes to things shall or must happen. I think those bits should be elevated to be a condition. Yep. With the proposed change that the wetland management plan be able to be certified by ORC instead of COUC, in the event that consent is required and obtained for ORC, and conditional on the provision of a similar plan. Given ORC's jurisdiction sits over wetlands, I'm pretty comfortable with that, with ORC being the agency to certify that plan.
So whereabouts are you? Have you seen it before? Is that very common?
Not saying I've come across before.
The only reason that's in there is to, given that CODC doesn't have the in-house staff, we didn't want an instance all the same. Wetland enhancement plan was having to be peer reviewed through ORC and then again peer reviewed. That's the only thing it's trying to stop happening. So if his concerns with the wording of that condition, it's fine, it can be deleted. It's just trying to be
Yeah, no issue. It works. Yeah. I understand the point. You're doing well.
With
Really?
up to condition, I'm up to condition 31. So, and for completeness, if I don't reference particular conditions, assume I'm okay with.
Yeah.
Agree that the Bone Glare management plan should also be certified by CODC. I think we just wrap that into the discussion around management plans.
Can I just double check, is that the intention, that Glint and Glare management plan would be certified by council?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great, thank you.
And for condition 32, I think there's some.
Oh, actually, I've got a question. There you go. There you go.
Yeah, 31, just buried down in the advice notes, there was that discussion, it's under C, Roman numeral 4, that's the physical alterations to the solar farm setup. There's been evidence on that, and I asked questions of the witness on that, and you were opposed to striking those words out initially, but is that still the position, or are you happy with that?
Given that wording says may include but are not limited to, I don't think it would hurt to have it there as an option. It's not something that the applicant would be forced to do.
Okay, thank you.
Those are just giving examples of things that could be done.
Understood. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's all I.
On the condition 31 B and C, it's sort of a complaints system. Is there a need? I've seen in other projects, there's more of a general condition around sort of general concerns raised by, or communication obligations of the consent holder to its particularly immediate neighbours in terms of particularly construction. And then obviously this is after that, but have you, I know I'm sort of putting you on the spot, but have you given any thought to whether there might be some value in that, given the concerns raised by, like, for example, Mrs. Voice around, being advised of particular construction activity so she can manage her business with her dogs? Do you see any value in a condition along those lines? Some sort of communication plan?
In relation to construction, or
Yeah, well,
just
maybe construction in particular, because I think that was the concern she had in terms of particularly piling noise and the impact of that on her dogs. I guess this clear one's more of an ongoing thing, but it was just a general question.
I think going back to this morning, I think it is worth looking at something like that. I think that could be one of the options for helping, specifically for Ms. Voice, helping manage those effects would be having communication channels.
Some sort of liaison process or a communication process or something. Yeah. Okay, so I'll leave you guys to think about that. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. For condition 32, there was some discussion around the consultation.
So back on 31, when we were talking to Ms. Van Heedy yesterday about this condition C, just presumably you're comfortable, it has affected parties in there, and I think I suggested would complainants be a better word or something like that. Are you comfortable with that change?
Yes, I'm comfortable. Okay.
Yeah.
For condition 32, there was some discussion earlier in the week about whether that should have similar consultation and provision of information requirements as condition 30.
Yes.
I agree that there should be similar wording in that condition.
Yeah. Do you know, and this may, if you don't, that's fine. There was a question, sort of a claim made by one of the submitters yesterday that FENS may not deal with these types of activities very often, and whether they would be the appropriate organisation to be giving council comfort around how fires will be managed on the site. Do you have any experience with that for other applications? I appreciate there might not be many similar, certainly in terms of the scale, but has that come up before that you're aware of?
Definitely nothing on this scale, and nothing's immediately jumping to mind. But I guess internally among the consenting team here, we've got a memorandum of understanding with FENS on some points. Pretty much everything else we'll try to defer to them when we can. Because at the end of the day, it's FENS staff that are going to be called to a fire.
Yes.
And it's not expertise that we have in-house.
So are you comfortable with the documentation that's been provided to us through the applicant's expert, Mr. Denise, and the correspondence I've had with FENS? Do you think that bottoms that issue out, or do you see any gaps there?
I think it gives me enough certainty that those, like, the fire masses can be worked out through conditions.
And when you say conditions, you're
Through management plans.
through the management plan specifically, because that allows them to have another involvement.
Correct.
Yes.
There were
Yeah.
so for the conditions. For condition 38, I think there's a question raised about dwellings built after the solar farm was constructed, and how that might impact with this condition. As a general rule, the rural chapter in a district plan would take a first in, first served approach when it comes to residential activity. So if a residential activity establishes after an activity that could have effects on it, that could have reverse sensitivity effects, we expect the dwelling to manage those effects. And we expect the residential activity to manage those effects.
Yeah.
So that's how I'd expect it to be managed through the consenting process for that house.
Yeah, I think that what generated that question was just my curiosity to know whether the noise limits would apply at the boundary regardless, in terms of, because I know the existing dwellings are reasonably well separated, but a future dwelling could be closer. It was just to know that situation. That's why I asked, and I think the applicant may respond to that question. But
You mean complied with?
yeah, with whether what the noise levels are on the boundary of the site, essentially, is what I'm saying. Yeah, just so we could determine whether there's scope for someone to build a house closer or not. And I know how this condition works, but no problem with understanding how it works. It's just a matter of knowing what would apply. So you don't need to respond to that. Okay. All right, thank you.
So for condition 42.
Well, before you get to 42,
Yeah.
40 relates to lighting.
Yes.
And there's concern raised yesterday from some submitters, concerned about a risk from lighting on the dark sky accreditation that's being sought.
Mhm.
Do you see any, based on the information that you have, do you think condition 40 suitably manages any dark sky impact on dark sky?
I think they do. I've drafted those conditions based on the provisions that apply inside the dark sky precinct.
Okay. And what can you give me a reference to those rules?
I don't know. Let's see. So in the district plan, we will be looking at light R1 through to light R7.
So, yeah. And is it your understanding that condition, I can ask, is that relates to both construction, the condition 40, both during construction and then operationally, and there's no need for a separate condition during both. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
For trying to get over to condition 42, happy that the frigate, happy that the frigate be the solar pump season operation for the decommissioning missions to kick off.
That is per the wording
As
from
per the
Ms.
wording.
Barnhany. Yeah, okay.
And the last point I had was to essentially recommend that the bond conditions stay in place. I covered that quite extensively this morning.
Yes. Which, that was further up, wasn't it?
Yeah, they're a bit further up. That
35.
was 35 through. So in IP2 or in the track changes version, that's 35 through 40.
And sorry, you might have covered this morning, my brain's starting to fade a little bit. You're based on the evidence from the applicant in the discussion I think you had with Commissioner Day-Cleven. Are you essentially recommending this wording that you had included, or are you suggesting there might be some benefit in having further thought and discussion on that with your
Probably the
team?
benefit of having some further discussion just to make sure it's clear that the intention wasn't to have a completely standalone.
Yeah.
bond, and potentially if there's any wrinkle that we worked out how a shared bond might.
Yeah, thank you. That's you.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Anything else? Brilliant. Well done. That's a great job. Very thorough. Appreciate you all, and thank you for your written notes that you prepared overnight for us. It made this much easier. Right. It's nearly 12:30. I think we've probably got two options. I'll be a bit guided by you, Mr. Minhinnick. We want to have a short adjournment to have a bit of a discussion on a few things so that when we come back to you around sort of next steps and reply, we're all clear. So we could either adjourn for lunch now, and we'll do that over the lunch break, or if you are all itching to get away, and I appreciate a lot of people, spend a lot of time in the hearing room, it may be preferable that we just take a 10-minute adjournment and then come back to you, because I don't think it'll take very long. Do you have a preference?
The latter, particularly given that, equally from my perspective, there are some very brief comments I wish to make, but I'm
Yes.
certainly not intending to do a full oral closing at this point. So
Yeah.
I think for everyone's benefit, it probably, if that is okay for the commissioners, to take a short adjournment now and then to wind up this part of the process.
Great. And just to let you know, I think I mentioned this morning, we've got a minute sort of accumulating. Our intention is to probably try and finalise that today and get that out tonight or possibly tomorrow.
Yes.
And so any comments you make today would be not your closing, just to be clear, that you'll have an opportunity to provide that in writing. Yeah. Yeah, okay, that will do. So we'll adjourn. Sorry, you look like you'll need to say something. No. We'll adjourn till we might need 15 minutes, 12:40. Thank you. Okay, so we have a list of sort of 10 matters that we would like you to cover in your reply, as well as Ms. Banhedy and Mr. Vincent doing some work on the conditions.
Yes.
Some of them sort of connect in a little bit to conditions, but I'll run through these briefly now, and we'll issue a minute hopefully tonight or tomorrow that just sets that out. So we're very happy for you to involve your experts as you need to in that. And please let us know, obviously, who's responded to what.
It's
Very helpful. So in terms of scale, we're interested to know how large is the proposal in terms of site and capacity compared to the other consented and applied for solar farms by Helios. In answer to a question from us, Mr. Shingling stated that the proposal is required to be a 30 megawatt capacity. 300 megawatt capacity in order to be a viable connection to the Naseby substation. That was in verbal response, and we're just wondering if he could confirm that is correct and what he's basing that on.
Yes.
In terms of contamination, the composition of the panels, particularly and potential risk of contamination to ground or groundwater, was raised by submitters, particularly given the failure rates expected by Mr. Shingling, and he said in response to our questions he expected a failure rate of between 1% and 5%. So again, he might want to confirm that is correct. I appreciate I'd asked him and he just sort of responded, so he may want to confirm his expectation around that. How and where are the potential impacts on soil and groundwater from contamination of solar panels particularly addressed in the application? And we do refer to the Becker hazardous substances assessment, which forms an appendix to the application, but doesn't appear to address solar panels specifically.
Yes.
Fire risk, regarding fire risk from the solar farm and the complexities of fighting such a fire, that was raised by several submitters. And for example, a fire that might originate at the centre of the solar panels area. Have FENS considered the complexity of responding to a fire in that scenario? And are they comfortable the risks and complexities can be sufficiently addressed in the fire management plan? And we're just mindful that FENS are a sort of an advisor to both council, and obviously your expert has relied on that correspondence. They're not a party to these proceedings, but are you comfortable that you can sort of ask them to come back through this process? Do you see any issue with that?
I'd have expected that Helios or Mr. Denise could liaise further with FENS, and then the correspondence can be provided
from them. Is it? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. In terms of a bond, Mr. Vincent clarified this morning that there's no, from his perspective, there's no duplication intended for a bond, so landowner and council, but that it would be appropriate for the council to be party to a bond to assist with their compliance obligations. Just looking for your comment on that, and some wording would be helpful if, even if you don't want to, you're not comfortable with a bond, I'd like the planners to provide us with some wording anyway. And you can make that clear that that's not your applicant's preference. In terms of mitigation planting, we've got quite a few matters here. Several submitters and Dr. Wells raised concerns that the proposed mitigation planting may struggle to thrive given the harsh climate, clay soils, and lack of water availability and wind. This is based on the personal experience of those submitters with planting at their properties in this general location, and also Dr. Wells' expertise. So given the transport assessment relies on successful mitigation planting to avoid yellow glare effects, and the landscape and visual assessment relies on successful mitigation planting to reduce landscape and visual effects down to minor, how can we be confident that that mitigation planting will be successful? In particular, what water sources are available to the site to use for irrigation? And I, particularly draw your attention to Dr. Wells's evidence this morning that really irrigation is necessary in his view. How viable are the use of water crystals at the scale required if irrigation isn't viable? Is there a risk to groundwater from the use of water crystals? Is wind protection proposed? And I think Dr. Wells, it may be Mr. Espy, suggested that it is common that you might plant a row of exotics to protect natives. Is that something that you'd consider, and how would that work? what would be the implications of starting planting sooner than once construction is underway? And would there be any merit in starting planting in advance of construction to give more confidence in its success of planting in terms of mitigation of glint and glare effects and landscape and visual effects? Community funding, and these are just a couple of things that we covered that you, Ms. Barnheedy said she would deal with in conditions, but just a reminder, to the applicant has committed to community funding, and I think she said she's happy to have those in the conditions. Same with staff transport and accommodation. It would be good to include the applicant's commitment to assisting with staff transport and accommodation in the conditions. Grazing. So submitters who have experience in managing livestock in the area have raised concerns about the practical difficulties in maintaining grazing at the site and or maintaining grass cover or managing vegetation height as committed to in the conditions. We are looking for you to generally address that concern, and just to let you know, there wasn't any evidence from your team really on this. We were sort of relying on bits and pieces, so we do see there's a little bit of a gap there. In terms of the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land, and I covered this when she appeared, but just a reminder, could Ms. Barnheedy clarify what are the functional need elements, what are the operational need elements of this proposal in terms of the NPS HPL, and also we heard a slightly different interpretation from Mr. Vincent this morning. It'd be really great if you could respond to that, probably both from a legal and a planning point of view, if possible. And then the last thing really relates to conditions. So our preference would be for Ms. Barnheedy and Mr. Vincent to work together on some conditions, provide those back to us, making it clear about where the levels of areas of agreement are, where the disagreement are. Very happy for the planners to talk to any of the experts or client or council, or there's no issue about conferencing rules there, and come back to us. So that's sort of what we're looking for, and then after that we'd be looking for a reply, your reply in writing. Oh, we've got one more. Oh yes, dogs. So the question if you can consider whether there may be some merit in including a reference to the dog vibration / noise impacts from construction in the construction management plan.
Yes, we've had a note of that to discuss with Mr. Richardson, so
Great.
on the list as well.
Sure. Yes. That's our list. And we would also need to talk timing about that, but in your hands really on.
Yes, Susan, and I wonder if, so as I understand it, between Ms. Barnheedy and Mr. Vincent, there have been discussions, they're both keen to sit down and work through the conditions, which is great. And maybe it's within 5 working days after those conditions are provided for the reply to then come in, just so that that can address any of the matters arising from those conditions.
Yes.
I would have hoped that we would be in a position to potentially file a reply by the end of next week or quite soon thereafter. But very conscious that there have been a number of these points raised that will require input from other parties or other experts, other members of the team. So just want to make sure that that's the intention, but if there is a need for any further time, if we're able to just come back and explain that,
that's fine.
Just to make sure that we are assisting you to the greatest degree possible.
Yes, no, that's no trouble. I mean, it's your application, so the sooner we get it, the sooner you'll get your decision.
Okay.
So in terms of that, do you have a sense, planners, how long you need to work on conditions?
My initial thoughts is that I could essentially do a bit of a track change over. I've been taking notes for your comments on the conditions. Circulate that through to our team probably tomorrow, and hopefully catch up with Adam either Tuesday or Thursday next week. I'm in another hearing on Wednesday,
Fair enough.
and then I'm on the West Coast on Friday. So
okay. So is
a day, less than a day, I'm thinking of Adam sitting down together.
Yeah, but in terms of when they'll be back to us, it may be that it's end of next week or after that, is it?
Mine will be the end of next week.
Okay, so does it suitable for you? So if we say 29th of August for the conditions to be back, which will identify areas of agreement and disagreement from the planners and any other experts, and then you'd be looking at your reply by, say, the 5th of September?
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll put that in our minute. If there's any reason why those dates are becoming problematic, please come back to us and we can consider that. It's really important that we get a good, complete picture at this point. This is our last, hopefully, our last opportunity, unless we think there's something else we need. So, take the time you need to do that. Right.
Excellent. Well, before we finish today, there were just a few things on behalf of the Helios that I did want to say. So, at the outset, do want to acknowledge all those who have made submissions, whether those are in support or opposition, and particularly all those who have presented as well and taken the time to present to you. Helios is certainly aware that there were keenly held views both for and against the proposal, and certainly acknowledge that it has been difficult for some, and also that the hearing process itself is unfamiliar to many. There have been a wide range of issues raised through submissions in particular. These have ranged from some very high-level matters in terms of New Zealand's electricity system as a whole, down to some very technical matters of electrical engineering and the like. Helios has carefully listened to the range of matters that have been raised, and particularly mindful of those neighbours as well who will be, if consent is granted, living next to what is proposed. Helios is keen to provide comfort to the council and community, and in that respect, it has already made a number of changes to the conditions to provide additional detail compared to what was in the original officer's report. And certainly the intention is to, through over the next week or so, through that further conferencing in light of the various matters raised, plus the indications from the panel, to try to provide some additional flesh on the bones of some of those conditions and to try to provide some additional comfort. So that is certainly something that Helios will be looking to do. Its position remains that it does respectfully seek that consent is granted, subject to those conditions that will be provided in due course. And then as a final point, just do wish to thank the council officers and experts, the hearing staff and the commissioners as well for the way that this hearing's been held and the broader processing of this application. So thank you from Helios.
Thank you. Great. All right. Well, we will adjourn the hearing. I also just want to reiterate thank you to the applicant team in terms of the way you've gone about the preparation of effects assessments and the way you've answered our questions and things. Very helpful. Thank you to all those who made the effort and were brave enough to come along and speak. It isn't everybody's favourite thing to do, but it really is helps us understand the full, complete picture of what this project would mean for this community. So we really thank you for those who came along and spoke. And I would also like to thank the council staff, Mr. Vincent and Taryn in particular, for all your amazing work. We genuinely could not do this without you. She's doing the world of work in the background. And thank you to Dr. Wells and Mr. Espy for their work as well, and to my fellow commissioners. So we'll adjourn. We will now go and do our site visit. We obviously have some information to come back to us, so conditions and then the applicant's reply. From there, we'll make a decision about whether we have enough information to grant or decline the application, to make a decision on the application. If we are happy we do have sufficient information, we will close the hearing, and then we will deliberate and make a decision and write that up, and that is issued in writing. So those are the next sort of steps to go. Anything else? Great. Thank you, everybody. Ngā mihi. Cheers.